Momentary Paws by Curran Winters, Book 2 of the Kitten Witch series. For the ad-free version or to get the rest of the series, pick up the audiobook at Curran Winters' Cozy Mystery Bookstore by going to cutecozymystery.com. Be sure to use discount code CUTE40 to take 40% off. Chapter 1. The broken broom had just closed up for the night, and Ember McNair had sent her employees home early, offering to handle the cleanup all by herself. "Are you sure?" asked Tara, one of her waitresses. The other one had already slung her purse over her shoulder and was halfway out the door. "Yes, I'm sure," Ember answered, practically beaming. "I've got this. You head home, kick up your feet. You've earned it." Tara didn't argue with that. As she left, she reflected fondly on the way her boss had been smiling all night long. Ember was always friendly, and her employees thought of her as very nice to work for. But the persistent smiling was new. If Tara had asked Kaylee, Ember McNair's fluffy kitten familiar, what had Ember smiling so much, Kaylee would have answered that it was all down to a certain dinner date with a certain Sheriff Cedric Jameson, after which Ember had been walking on air for a few days now. If Tara had asked Talico, the ghost of Ember's ancestor who lingered around the broken broom and invisibly picked up gossip all around town, Talico would have answered that Ember was grateful that the recent troubles that had put the broken broom, a family business stretching back several generations, into a distinct earnings slump, had ended, and after a few weeks of steady business, the pub was finally back in the black. But Tara couldn't ask either Kaylee or Talico these things, because to her, Kaylee was just a normal cat, and Talico was careful never to show himself around the non-magical citizens of Couchemar, Louisiana. As a matter of fact, Tara had been working for Ember several years now, and had never once guessed that her boss was a witch. Inside the broken broom, Ember gave a little whistle, casting a spell that enchanted a few of the remaining glasses along the bar to dance themselves through the air and into the kitchen sink. She probably shouldn't be using such flashy, visible magic in front of the wide windows that looked out over the main street in Couchemar, but she was feeling too happy, and the streets were empty now anyway. The only reason people stayed out late in Couchemar was to drink at the broken broom, and now that it was closed, everyone would be home and heading to sleep. Yes, the troubles were over. Couchemar was back to its usual uneventful self, and Ember couldn't be happier about it. No sooner did she think this, however, than a sudden wind blew the pub door open, and a slightly larger than usual black bat came swooping in. Of course, the appearance of this bat wasn't odd in and of itself. Ember knew this particular black bat well. She recognized it even before it began to change shape, body growing and changing and morphing into the form of Sage Wyant, Ember's best friend. No, what was odd was the stunned look on Sage's face and the fact that she was slightly out of breath. "You'll never guess what just happened," Sage said eagerly. "Wait, why are you flying around as a bat?" Ember asked, not quite processing what Sage had said. "Oh, that?" Sage smiled faintly and shrugged. "It's mosquito season, right? They're all over. It's a lot easier and cheaper to keep myself fed as a bat. And besides, I think of eating up the mosquitoes downtown as a sort of civic service I perform. Bats are a very important part of the fight against communicable, blood-based diseases, you know." "Oh, okay," Ember said. She wondered if Sage actually liked the taste of mosquitoes, though she guessed if she was flying around in bat form eating them up, there must be something tasty about them. "Sorry, what were you going to tell me?" Already, however, Ember had a sinking feeling that she'd spoken too soon, and that Couchemar was not quite as uneventful as she'd hoped. "Natalie Gordon was found dead at the convenience store," Sage said, confirming Ember's worst fears. "Oh my goodness," Ember said, placing her hand to her heart. "Why didn't you lead with that information?" "I tried," Sage objected. "You asked me about my bat form. And then you gave me a micro-lecture about ecosystems instead of telling me about Natalie Gordon." Ember tried to take it in. Natalie Gordon was the manager of the convenience store. She was young. Younger than Ember, even. "Was it some kind of accident?" "No one knows for sure," Sage said. "An employee found her sometime late this afternoon. I guess she had a horrible bloody wound to the head." That could be an accident, Ember said. It could be, Sage agreed. Neither of them believed it, however. They both had magical instincts, and their instincts were screaming murder. Well, Ember said, setting her sinking feelings at the distressing news aside, this will be an interesting investigation. I agree, Sage said, walking over to the bar and taking a seat. Is that a cherry tart left in the display case? The Broken Broom was famous for its desserts, some of which Ember made herself, and some of which she sourced from local fairy baker Lila Delacroix's Heavenly Sweet Things Bakery. On the rare occasion there were any remaining pastries or treats remaining in the display case come closing time, Ember would sometimes give one to Sage. This time, she cut the tart in half, and the two saw at the bar a while talking, sharing all the information they knew about Natalie, which wasn't much. She was gorgeous, young, and to all appearances healthy, but neither of them had picked up much about her social life, despite the fact that they'd lived in the same tiny, gossip-loving town for years and years. I'll keep my ears open for any information I can pick up about her, Sage promised, knowing that Ember was insatiably curious about these sorts of things. All right, she said, pushing her now empty saucer away after swiping up the last few crumbs and licking them off her finger. I'm still hungry. I think I'll head out again for a few more. At that, she changed into her bat form, so Ember knew she wasn't going off in search of more cherry tarts. Ember smiled after her friend gratefully. She knew that, with Sage's considerable, bat-powered ears on the case, she'd know all she wanted to know about Natalie in short order. Whatever had happened to Natalie Gordon, Ember was sure it would be figured out in no time. And then Couchemar would be back to normal again. Chapter 2. All through the next morning as she got ready to open the Broken Broom for the day, Ember tried to distract herself with her work, but she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened to Natalie. It was so tragic that someone so young and, to all evidence as far as Ember was away, pleasant to be around would die in such a sudden and unexpected way. At one point, Ember even tried meditating, which sometimes allowed her to commune with ghosts and reapers, to see if there were any obvious scars or disturbed spirits who might know what had happened to Natalie or help point Ember in the right direction. But the only spirit who responded was Talako, who showed up and gave Ember a sad smile. I'm sure all will be understood in time, he told her. Kaylee, who had sensed Ember's disturbance this morning and insisted on coming along to work at the pub with her today, hopped up onto her lap and nodded primly. You know Sheriff Jameson is on the case? This time, Kaylee didn't even sound like she was teasing Ember about the date the sheriff had taken her on. It actually sounded like Kaylee was trying to console her. Ember scratched Kali's forehead and smiled at Talako, feeling grateful that she was surrounded by so many people who cared about her. Sage dropped in again later in the day. The pub was full of customers taking late lunches and others getting an early start on their evenings, but one of the waitresses was on shift, so Ember took her break and went to sit with Sage at one of the tables outside where they wouldn't be overheard. So? Sage prompted. So? Ember echoed, not sure what Sage was getting at. Are you going to take up the case, Natalie's death? Why would I take it up? Ember asked, confused. Well, you solved the last case practically single-handedly, Sage pointed out. I did not. Sage gave Ember an unconvinced look. At her feet, Kaylee also leveled a stop-pretending expression in her direction. All right, Ember conceded. Maybe I helped the local sheriff's office a little more than the paperwork indicates. That doesn't make me a detective or anything like a local authority. Maybe, but you were completely in your element solving that case, Sage said. And it's horrible what happened to Natalie. If you could help get to the bottom of it, why wouldn't you? Ember held up both her hands in a position of surrender. I don't want to step on anyone's toes here. I made enough of a nuisance of myself last time. But between the two of us, if we keep our eyes and ears open, I'm sure Cedric will listen if we throw him a tip or two. Sage beamed and clapped her hands together excitedly. Great! Now let's talk about the case. Do we even know that there is a case? Well, we do know that she died under very suspicious circumstances, Sage said. And we do know she wasn't always treated very well in this town. What do you mean? Kaylee asked. Sage and Ember exchanged glances. Natalie was a really beautiful woman, Ember answered. The fact is that some of the women in town, the insecure, bitter ones, Sage piped up. Some of the women were pretty awful to her, Ember finished, and the men weren't much better either. Which is really horrible, Sage added mournfully, because I don't think I ever saw Natalie be anything other than really, truly innocent and sweet. Me too. I mean, I'd be the first to admit I didn't know her well. It's possible there was another side to her, but all I ever saw was kindness. And I've never heard a bad word, Sage said. Ember and Callie both knew that this was a high endorsement indeed. If there were ever bad words circulating around Couchemar, there was a high probability that, at some point or another, Sage Wyant would hear them. Just then something flickered in Ember's vision, like the faintest glimmer of light, not far off and faint but effervescent, inchoate, right in front of her face. She blinked, then rose to her feet, trying to clear her vision to see what was struggling to appear. Sage got to her feet too, sensing something strange and looking at her friend. What is it? Sage began softly, but Ember silenced her with a finger over her lips. The light returned, then moved, pulsing ever so slightly. It looked wispy and faint enough that Ember might inadvertently blow it away, so she held her breath and watched, wide-eyed, as the light bent itself into the faintest outline of a human's shape. Devoid of distinctive features, but unmistakably a woman. In the absence where a face should be, the light parted, allowing sudden nighttime darkness through in the form of a mouth. The softest words seeped out, little more than a wheeze on the wind. I didn't. Then, with a final glimmer, the light dispersed. Ember took in a deep, shocked breath. Her finger fell from her lips. What was that? Sage asked, evidently aware that the spirit had gone. A ghost, Ember said. I think. Didn't you see it? Hear it? No, but I felt something. Sage shuddered theatrically. Weren't you meditating earlier, Ember? Kaylee prompted, reaching out for Natalie's spirit. Ember nodded. I think that must have been Natalie. It was a feeling more than a certainty, but the feeling was strong. Wait a second, Sage said. You asked if I heard it. Did it talk? What did it say? She said I didn't, Ember repeated, turning the words over as she spoke them aloud. Evidently, there was something Natalie Gordon didn't do, something she felt was important enough to state even if it meant coming back as a ghost to do it. Perhaps there were reasons Ember should involve herself in helping figure out what had happened to Natalie after all. She might not be a police officer, no, but Natalie's ghost hadn't appeared to a police officer. Ember had powers that might be able to help settle Natalie's spirit and bring justice for whatever had happened to her. And if there was any chance that Ember could help, then she was going to take it. Chapter 3. Ember didn't remember ever meeting Darren Cogdell before he walked up to her at the Broken Broom bar that same afternoon and introduced himself. He looked vaguely familiar, but she didn't think she'd ever spoken a word to him before. That was strange in and of itself, since Ember met just about everyone who lived in Couchemar at one time or another. But the really strange part came early in the conversation when he stunned her by saying, "Frank and sudden, I hear you can help innocent people who have been accused of murder." Ember gave him a second, considering look. He was clean-shaven, round-faced, pale with watery eyes. He had flat brown hair, which kept getting flatter as he nervously reached up to pat it down. I don't know who you've been talking to, Ember said, trying to sound patient but firm. But I'm afraid they're mistaken. He shook his head. It was that one woman, Sage. She says she's a friend of yours. That if I was getting caught up in the horrible business with Natalie, that you'd help me out. Ember closed her eyes and sighed. She'd need to have a little chat with Sage about not offering out her services to random people she encountered. After all, Ember was determined to help figure out what had happened to Natalie, not to exonerate people she didn't even know. Still, if this Darren Cogdell thought he might be suspected for murder, it would be worth Ember's while to hear him out. Sheriff Jameson and his department are on the case, Ember demurred. I'm sure they're fully capable of figuring out who's innocent and who's guilty. Why would you want my help? At this, Darren smiled shyly. Everyone knows that you had something to do with the solving of those last murders, and that was such a difficult case. I just think if you get involved in this one, it would be helpful to you to hear from me that I'm innocent. Okay, Ember said. Then I guess you could start by telling me how you knew Natalie. I loved her, Darren answered, abrupt and intense, eyes widening in emphasis. I was absolutely, utterly in love with her, and I would never, ever hurt her in any way. That's what they wouldn't understand. I know what it can look like, but I'd do anything before I'd hurt her. Now Ember understood why Darren looked familiar. She'd seen him nearly every single time she'd set foot in Natalie's shop. He'd be hanging around the counter or else lingering in some aisle or another, always leaving himself a good vantage point to peep at Natalie as she rang up her customers. Suddenly, Ember wanted even less to do with Darren than before. I'm not sure how believable that is, Darren, she said frankly. Everyone knows you were always watching Natalie, hanging around her shop and bothering her. I know, he said, cradling his head in his hands. That's why I need your help. To get the cops past the easy answer that I was the one who did it. To get them to find her real killer. Slowly, Ember nodded. She still wasn't sure she could believe Darren, but she could at least get more information out of him first. Okay, she muttered slowly, thinking. Maybe the fact that you were always around could be a help to us, in a way. Did you see anyone weird hanging around the store that night? Actually, he answered glumly. That was the first night I hadn't been watching her. I was home drinking, trying to get her off my mind. So you didn't see anything potentially helpful? He shook his head. I've been going over it and over it the last couple of days and who or what I might have seen that was out of place, but I can't think of anything. Ember sighed. All right, Darren, I promise I'm going to do my best to figure out who killed Natalie. He must have noticed that she wasn't committing to helping absolve him of the crime. Even so, he looked heartened at her words, and he thanked her profusely before leaving the broken broom. Well, what do you think about Darren Cogdell? Ember asked Kaylee during a quiet moment later in the evening. I think he sounds a little pathetic, frankly, Kaylee said. And obviously, it's far from okay to follow a woman around when she doesn't want you there. Obviously, Ember said with a shudder. But I wouldn't think he could kill anyone, Kaylee said. And I didn't sense an out-and-out lie. Kaylee had a talent for being able to tell when people were being truthful. Of course, this didn't mean that Darren wasn't capable of killing Natalie, or even that he hadn't. It might have simply meant he was self-deluded enough to believe what he was saying when he was saying it. You might be surprised, Ember remarked. He seems really unhinged. I'm sure a guy like that could hurt someone, and then do all the mental and emotional acrobatics required to convince himself it wasn't his fault. She sighed, then, wiping down the bar with a little extra frustrated vigor. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. We don't even know if it was a murder yet. However, no sooner did she say this than Sheriff Cedric Jameson walked in, looking exhausted and desperate for a perk-up cup of coffee. She had the cup poured by the time he reached the bar. Thanks, he said, distracted. Don't mention it, she told him, sliding the mug into his hands. Natalie Gordon? He nodded, frowning deeply. I shouldn't be telling you this, of course, but it'll be in the papers in no time, he said. She died from an ice pick to the ear. Ember's eyes widened. That sounds premeditated to me. To us, too, Cedric said. It looked like Couchemar had another murder on its hands after all. Chapter 4. The sun was at its zenith when Ember and Sage stopped in at Natalie's convenience store, and the heat hung thick in the air. Sage rapidly fanned her face to try to cool down, but the action was mostly in vain. Ember, think you can hurry up with the door? Sage asked. She held her thumb and forefinger mere millimeters apart and said, I'm this close to bursting into flames. I know, Ember replied as she closely inspected the lock on the front door. Just one more second. Ember muttered a spell with her hand hovering above the lock, and the two soon heard the audible click as it sprung open. Ember pulled the door open, and the two women were met with a rush of ice-cold air. Thank goodness, Sage said as she pushed inside the convenience store. She stood inside and let the cool air wash over her. Ember peeked her head into the icebox of a store and raised an eyebrow. Sage? She questioned. Hmm? Sage responded, her eyes closed as she soaked in the cool air. This is weird, right? No one's here, and yet the air conditioner is turning this place into a giant freezer? Sage opened her eyes, her comfort spoiled by the realization. Yeah, I guess it is a little strange. Sage shifted uncomfortably on her feet and crossed her arms over her chest. With it being so hot outside, I would have thought it would be pretty warm and stuffy in here. Sage looked around the store with new sight now that her body temperature had regulated. Something's not right here, Sage said solemnly. Do you sense something? Ember asked her friend. Yeah, Sage replied. It smells like anger. Jealousy, too. Whatever happened here, there was a lot of emotion attached to it. This was a murder with intent. I suppose that should have been obvious from the murderer's choice of an ice pick, Ember said. That's not exactly the weapon of someone without an emotional motive. Sage began shivering and wrapped her arms tighter around herself. I don't like this, Ember. I know, Sage, Ember said as she walked toward her friend. I feel the malice here. I can't imagine what it feels like for you. Do you want to wait outside? No, Sage responded. I don't want to leave you in here alone. Let's just be quick, okay? Neither of us should be in here long with this kind of energy around. Agreed, said Ember with a decisive nod. The two separated and began searching the store for any clues the police might have missed. Ember looked up and saw the rotund orbs emerging from the ceiling. Security cameras. Sage had noticed them too. Think there's anything interesting on those cameras, Em? Sage asked. Maybe, Ember replied. But I'm sure Cedric has already taken any footage from the cameras. If there's anything useful on there, he'll find out. Fair enough, said Sage. The two returned to searching, careful not to touch anything unnecessarily. Ember walked behind the counter and inspected it closely. Nothing. She was about to move on when she happened to look down and noticed the glint of something metal, barely peeking out from underneath the counter. Ember crouched down to get a closer look. The object was lodged firmly under the counter, and she still couldn't tell what it was. Hey, Sage, come check this out, Ember called. Sage walked over to the counter and knelt down by Ember. She looked where Ember pointed out the object. Any guess what it is? Ember turned and asked Sage. Sage mused. I can't tell. It looks like it's been there for a while, though. You're right, Ember replied. Ember meticulously reached for the object and grabbed it delicately with her thumb and forefinger. Whatever it was, it didn't budge, stuck from the years of lax cleaning policies at the store. Ugh, groaned Ember. She finally dislodged the item and held it up to get a better look. It was a child-sized bracelet like a toy from a vending machine. Ember turned it over, careful to avoid touching it unnecessarily. One side was decorated with a heavily faded picture of dinosaurs. Wow, said Sage, feigning interest. Do you think the killer was a paleontologist? Ember glared at Sage. Sorry, Sage held up her hands. Just kidding. Ember tossed the toy back on the floor. It had obviously been there long before the murder. Just a piece of trash lost to time. Ember sighed and looked around again. She didn't think they would find anything more. Come on, let's go. This place is... Ember paused as she looked around the store, then added, oppressive. Sage happily responded, You don't have to tell me twice. Quickly, the two women walked outside and back into the sweltering heat. Ember used her magic to relock the front door, ensuring they left the store almost exactly as it was when they arrived. What are you going to do now? Sage asked. I guess I'll check in with Cedric, said Ember. Maybe he has some leads I can check out. Sage's face lit up with a sly grin at Ember's mention of Cedric's name. And getting to see Cedric probably doesn't hurt either. She gently nudged Ember with her elbow. What? Ember asked. Number Sage, it's strictly business. We both want to solve the case, and Cedric has resources that I just don't. Sage smiled and began walking toward the car. Sure. That makes sense. Ember fumed. Just because Sage was her friend didn't mean she wasn't annoying sometimes, especially when she was right. Chapter 5. Ember waited in line at the local coffee shop. She and Cedric had decided they would have an easier time talking things over in person, and they both could always go for a caffeine boost. After Ember ordered, she walked to a secluded, quiet corner of the shop with her very large mug of black coffee. Cedric hadn't arrived yet, so she sat in one of the overstuffed sofa chairs and started reading a book on her phone. She was so engrossed in her reading that she didn't notice Cedric arrive until he was walking up to her with his extra dry soy cappuccino. Ember set down her phone and smiled up at him. Hey Cedric, thanks for meeting me, she said. Of course, Cedric responded. Sorry, I'm a little bit late. Police work and all that. Oh, it's fine, Ember replied sarcastically. It's not like it's your job or anything. The two chuckled together before Cedric sat down and things got serious. So, Ember started, the convenience store. I noticed they had security cameras, and I'm assuming you did too. Anything useful on there? Negative, Cedric replied. Whoever did this was smart enough to think ahead. The camera connection was cut off by the time of the murder. Damn, Ember sighed. I had hoped they might have missed that. Are there any cameras outside the store that could have caught the person leaving? Unfortunately not, Cedric said, defeated. The closest place with security cameras is blocks away. One of the negative things about living in a small town, I suppose. Ember speculated. Even so, I think I'd rather that than the constant surveillance in big cities. Very true, replied Cedric. But as a detective, I can't say it isn't helpful to have that kind of technology. The two sat in silence for a moment, both thinking to themselves about what other avenues their investigation might take. Cedric looked up as realization spread across his face. How did you know about the security cameras? Oh, Ember exclaimed, loud enough that a few of the nearby patrons turned to see what all the fuss was about. Sorry, Ember mouthed to them before they turned back to their own conversations. Cedric held her in his questioning gaze. Ember searched for a good excuse. Guessed. Most convenience stores have security cameras. Cedric mused. He clearly didn't believe her. You do know that it's illegal to just walk onto an active crime scene like that, right? I know, Ember tried to placate him. But I just wanted to double-check. Besides, we left it exactly as it was when we got there. Cedric raised an eyebrow and looked up at her, a slight grin playing on his lips. Of course. Well, Ember tried to change the subject. Do you have any other leads? Cedric rested his elbows on his knees and buried his head in his hands. Nope, Cedric replied. Darren is still our best suspect. Ember frowned. What do you mean? We already know that Darren stalked Natalie in the past, Cedric said. It just makes the most sense. Ember said, mostly to herself. Darren had told her he couldn't remember anything from the night of the murder. And he has no alibi, Cedric continued. He claims he was completely blacked out that night. Yeah, that's what he told me too. But do you really think it could have been him? Asked Ember. I'm not sure, to be honest, replied Cedric, but we can't rule him out, at least not yet. Do you have any other leads? Ember asked. I know Natalie wasn't exactly close with her ex-husband, Jonathan. Oh, we've definitely considered it. Exes are always prime suspects in cases like this, said Cedric, a bit despondent. But, Ember asked, there was something Cedric was obviously leaving out. But, Cedric looked up into her piercing blue eyes. "We can't find him." Cedric picked up his barely touched cappuccino. They had been talking so intensely that their coffee was forgotten, meaning the foam tulip that adorned his drink was now just a cold, bubbly mess. Not one to waste a cup of coffee, Cedric drank the entire thing in just a few large gulps. "You know," Ember said, noticing Cedric's grimace as the foamy mess slid down his throat, "that doesn't happen with just regular coffee." With that, Ember picked up her own mug and took a sip. She clearly had some trouble swallowing hers as well. "Are you sure about that?" Cedric acerbically responded. That wasn't exactly the face of someone happy with what they just drank. Ember replaced her mug on the small table and tried not to smile at Cedric. "What do you mean? I didn't make a face." Sure, said Cedric. "Do you think you'd be willing to say that under oath?" Ember genially smacked Cedric's arm. "Oh, shut up, sure, the coffee isn't as good cold." "And?" Cedric led her on. "And?" Ember replied. "I'm sorry I made fun of your drink." "There we go," Cedric said happily. The two shared some small talk for a few minutes before getting up to leave. Ember and Cedric stood just outside the coffee shop and said their goodbyes for the evening. As Ember walked back to her car, she turned to get another good look at Cedric. There could definitely be worse people to work with. Ember turned back towards her car and smiled shyly to herself. Chapter 6. Darren Cogdell ambled his way from his home to the Broken Broom for lunch. His head hung low, mainly out of sadness at losing Natalie, but also to avoid seeing any suspicious looks from the townsfolk. Anyone who shopped in Natalie's store would know he spent a lot of time there. He sat at a table in the corner of the pub and pulled out some notes he'd been working on at home. He had no intention of working. He just wanted to keep himself to himself. Ember stood from stocking the lower shelves of the bar. As she checked the length of the bar for any customers, she noticed Darren sitting near the coat rack in the corner. She wiped her hands down the front of her apron and made her way over to his table. "Hi, Darren, how are you? Can I get you something?" Darren smiled and held up his menu. "I'll have this roast beef on rye with a side of fries, please." "Anything to drink?" she asked while writing down his food order. "A beer, please." "Okay, I'll get on that for you," Ember said. Ember, have you heard anything else about Natalie's death?" His expression was desperate. Ember quickly checked that no one needed serving at the bar and sat in the chair opposite. "Not much, I'm afraid," she confessed, although she wasn't sure how much she would tell him anyway. He was on Cedric's suspect list after all. Darren rubbed his hands over his face and sighed. "I wish I could remember what happened that night. I really want to be able to help catch whoever did this. But I was drinking heavily and I passed out on the sofa. No idea what time that was, though." Ember was about to console him when out of the corner of her eye, she saw a speck of light. It was the same as before, an effervescent light pulsing in the air, desperately trying to form itself, to become more. She watched it slowly move towards Darren. Darren followed Ember's eyes and jolted back in his chair as he saw the light by his right shoulder. His eyes widened and his fingers turned white on the arms of his chair as he tried to look at Ember without turning his head away from the orb. "What the hell?" His voice was low and unsteady. Ember continued to watch the orb. Her breath held as it morphed with fluidity into the shape of a woman, just as she'd seen before. Neither of them spoke as the entity gained more depth and features. It was Natalie. Darren took a sudden deep inhale as he realized who it was before collapsing onto the floor in a heap of sobs. Ember dragged her eyes away from the vision and attempted to help Darren off the floor, but he was slumped over and obviously had no desire to move. "What happened?" Cedric was at Ember's side. "Oh my goodness, thank heaven you're here," she said before thanking the customers who had also rushed over to see what was going on. They returned to their seats and Cedric moved into the corner to speak to Darren. "Darren, it's Sheriff Jameson. Let's get you up, shall we?" Darren's sobbing lulled, and he allowed Cedric to help him to his feet. Meanwhile, Ember watched the spirit of Natalie gradually evaporate from view. She sighed heavily. Natalie had disappeared without saying a word. "I'm going to take Darren home," Cedric announced as he supported Darren by his elbow and began walking him towards the exit. Ember ran in front of them to open the door as they left. "I give you a call," Cedric said with a short smile before leaving. Once the lunchtime rush was over, Ember popped out the back to the large storage room and called upon Talako, who appeared through the wall. "I sense you are troubled, child." His tone was as stoic as his demeanor. Ember gave him a forced grin. "You're not wrong, Talako. I need to ask you something." Talako silently indicated she should continue. "I keep seeing Natalie, the dead girl, and I think she wants to tell me something, but the only thing she's managed so far was I didn't." "Do you have any idea what she meant by that?" "Nope. That's why I need you. If you can find her in that realm of yours, could you talk to her and find out what she wants me to know?" "I can try, but I must warn you that sometimes spirits don't always like to talk to other spirits." "Oh, okay," Ember said, disappointed. "Why's that?" The tall, burly spirit shrugged his shoulders. "It's a thing," he said before evaporating back into the wall. Ember couldn't help but laugh at his use of modern language. She made her way back to the bar and saw her phone flashing on the back shelf. She rushed to answer it. "Hi, it's me," Cedric said. Ember caught her breath. "I know. Your name comes up on my screen." "Why do you sound like you've been running?" "Because I was out the back and had to run to my phone at the other end of the bar." The line went dead and Ember looked at her screen. It was black. She furrowed her brow and was about to call him back when she noticed a tall blonde guy standing by the ficus plant. She screwed up her face and placed her hands on her hips. "You keep doing that." "I wanted to see how fit you were," Cedric said dryly. Ember sighed and shook her head. "How's Darren?" "We had a rather informative chat about Natalie. I do believe he was in love with her, but he also expressed his disgust at seeing her with other men." "He admitted that to you?" "To be honest, he was in a bit of a state, so I'm not sure he filtered what he was telling me." "So, do you think he could have killed her to stop her seeing other men?" Cedric looked directly into Ember's eyes. "It wouldn't be the first time a man has killed to try and hold on to the one he loves." Chapter 7. Considering what happened the day before, Ember was surprised when Darren came back into the Broken Broom the next day for lunch as well. He was looking shaken and a little peaky, but from the way his eyes were scanning frantically left and right around the room as he took his seat alone at a table, Ember thought he was probably hoping to catch another sight of Natalie's ghost. Kaylee saw Ember looking sadly out into the crowd of customers. She peeked over the bar and noticed Darren too, twitchy and nervous, and casting eager, worried glances around. "I guess it's better to see the ghost of your dead loved one, rather than to never see them again at all," Kaylee remarked. But even Kaylee's philosophical spin sounded pitifully sad, and Ember rallied and went to intercept Tara before she reached Darren's table with the menu. "I've got this one," Ember said. "Thank goodness," Tara said, giving Ember a significant, "I'd rather not deal with this creep right now" look. "I owe you one, boss." Tara's reaction to Darren only made Ember sadder. Still, she couldn't allow her sympathy for this man to distract her completely from the idea that he might be responsible for a horrible, violent murder. "Hey, Darren," Ember said, approaching the table and setting a menu down in front of him. "Can I get you something to drink?" Darren looked up at her with sad, watery eyes and reached up to flatten his hair nervously. "Oh, hello. Just a beer, if that's all right." It was just afternoon, a little early for beer, but from the looks of him, Darren had started his evening early already. "No problem at all." Ember stepped away to get his drink and give him a little time with the menu. She was just filling his glass from the tap when she noticed some women standing up from a nearby booth and heading over to Darren's table. She recognized the women, Ember realized. They were friends of Natalie's. With just a tiny bit of magic, Ember was able to eavesdrop on what they were saying even through the crowded room. "Did you have to go and kill our friend for?" One of them, a tall woman with big red hair, was demanding tearfully. She never did you any harm. Darren was already crying like a sprung leak, sniffling and blubbering at them in a way that half guttered out his words as he stammered to defend himself. I didn't do it. Didn't do it. I would never. We told her you were a creepy stalker, said the red-haired woman. We warned her to do more than just get a restraining order against you, to actually get the cops to enforce them for once. We practically had to beg her to get those orders in the first place. She told us she could take care of herself. Darren was starting to shake his head frantically. He reached up to cover his face with his hands. And you know what? I think she probably could have taken care of herself if you'd fought fair. But you figured out some way of getting to her. Some creepy little underhanded way. I'm innocent, Darren cried. I'm innocent. Ember wasn't sure what to make of all of this. After all, she wasn't so certain about Darren's guilt as these women were. But they had known Natalie better than Ember did, knew far more about her life. And Ember wasn't willing to lay her reputation on the line by vouching for Darren either. However, customers at surrounding tables were starting to pay attention to what was going on, and as much as she didn't want Darren to be traumatized at her pub for a second day in a row, she especially didn't want anyone to make a scene. So Ember hustled over to Darren's table, set his beer in front of him, and then turned to face Natalie's friends. I'd like to kindly ask you not to harass my customers, she said, trying to ease the tough words with a smile. She knew that being small made her less threatening, which often made it easy for her to say what she meant without coming across as pushy. The fact is that no one knows for sure what happened to Natalie, not yet. But if you have any specific information, I'd say that Sheriff Jameson would be incredibly interested to hear about it. If you'd like any assistance in passing evidence along to him, I can get you his number. The women didn't even answer Ember, only glared and then, after aiming a few more acid looks in Darren's direction, turned on their heels and left the pub. Ignoring the lingering, curious glances from surrounding patrons, Ember sat in the chair across from Darren and waited until he had pulled himself together enough to uncover his face. I didn't know about the restraining orders, she said once she saw his eyes again. Darren sniffled. Oh no, you don't understand. Those were just a big misunderstanding. Mistake. How does someone file a restraining order by mistake? He shook his head again, frustrated that Ember still wasn't getting it. Natalie and I became friends. I promise. We did. She would never have put out another one of those orders on me. And I meant what I said the other day, that I would never hurt her. Ember heaved a long, exhausted sigh. She was a little tired of not knowing that truth about Darren's relationship with Natalie. She wished it was possible for her to believe what Darren was saying, but he hardly seemed like the most reliable witness here. She reached across the table and pulled the glass of beer back, out of Darren's reach. Listen, she said. I think you should go home. I'll send you with some food if you need it. But if I were you, I'd have myself a nice little shower, get a little sleep. Darren didn't look convinced. He flicked another glance around, looking out for Natalie's ghost. Sober up, Ember told him as compassionately as he could manage. He flinched, clearly embarrassed, then nodded and rose from the table. Ember watched him go, not rising from her chair until he'd made it safely out of the pub without being harassed by anyone else. That was weird, Kaylee remarked when Ember rejoined her behind the bar. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, Ember said grimly, that I want to talk to Natalie even more now than I did before. Chapter 8. Talako appeared as Ember was closing up the bar that night. Any luck finding Natalie? Ember asked as soon as he had materialized, too eager to even say hello. Talako shook his head gravely. Not yet. I will continue to search for her. But I wanted to check on you. She's all fired up to figure out what was really going on with Natalie and Darren, Kaylee explained to Talako conspiratorially. If we can't talk to her directly just yet, Ember reasoned, then I'm at least going to go check out her house. Talako and Kali exchanged a look. It was impossible to talk Ember out of something like this when she got it into her head. Better just to assist her and try to help make sure she didn't get caught. Besides, both Talico and Kali had begun to grow very curious about what had happened to poor Natalie Gordon, as well. And if solving her murder and appeasing her spirit meant they had to help break into the victim's house, well, it wouldn't be the first time. "Allow me to scout out her house," Talico offered. "Let you know if there's anyone around." "I don't think she lived with anyone," Ember said, dismissive. "But this is a murder victim, don't forget," Kaylee piped up. "The police may be crawling around, and I know you and the sheriff are close." "Don't you start," Ember said, automatic. "But I doubt he'd be overly pleased to catch you red-handed breaking and entering. Might make for some unpleasant paperwork on his end." Ember sighed. "Fine." Then, turning to Talico, she said, "Thank you. It would be a huge help if you'd take a quick peek and let us know what you find." Talico inclined his head and phased out, leaving Ember to continue with the closing up work on her own for a few minutes, while she and Kaylee waited for Talico's return. She had just locked up the money from the cash register when Talico came back with the news that all was well at Natalie's place. She smiled. "Will you two hold down the fort here?" she asked Kaylee and Talico. "I'll just be gone a spell." Then, before either could answer, she poofed out of sight. Kaylee frowned wryly at Talico. "Maybe you'd better go keep an eye out." Talico didn't need to be told twice. Ember didn't date to turn on a light and alert anyone outside to the fact that there was someone snooping around in Natalie's house. However, the complete darkness startled her at first, and Ember had to wait, frozen in place for a little while to allow her eyes to adjust. Once they did, she slowly looked around, taking in what she was seeing. Natalie kept a tidy little place with sweet, homey decorations. There were some hoops on the wall that mounted what must have been Natalie's own embroidery work. Delicate little flowers and suns and birds done up in small, pretty stitches. The sight of those sweet little embroidered pictures almost broke Ember's heart, thinking about the woman who had made them. "All right, Ember," she whispered to herself. "Pull yourself together. That's what you're doing here. Trying to solve her murder." So she started to move through the house on the lookout for any piece of furniture where Natalie might have stashed important documents, items, anything that could provide a little insight into what those last weeks of her life had looked like. There was a nice antique fold-down desk in the living room, left mercifully unlocked and open. As Ember approached, she saw there, in addition to a few neat stacks of envelopes, Natalie had evidently left out a single opened envelope, with a piece of paper half spilling out from inside. Carefully, Ember rotated the envelope so she could have a look. It was addressed to Natalie from her ex-husband, John. The paper itself only had a single sentence written on it, in sharp, aggressive handwriting. "This isn't the end of it." Ember's eyebrows ticked up in surprise. She thought she picked up the slightest whiff of fear, Natalie's fear, that she must have experienced when opening up this letter and reading the message inside. The same sense pervaded one of the desk's drawers. She pulled it open as quietly as she could, then dug through its contents. In addition to a few bits and bobs, she found another stack of envelopes, all addressed to Natalie from John, all bearing the same faint impression of fear. Ember got restless spending too much time in one place. She left the letters where they were for now, reasoning that she could pick them up later, but really she was feeling a strange, sudden compulsion to search elsewhere in the house. No sooner had she started to poke around in the other items of furniture in the living room than something phased into view right in front of her. She froze, terrified, but then relaxed a second later when she realized who it was who had appeared. "Talico," she said, heaving a soft sigh. "Didn't I tell you about warning me before you?" "There isn't time for that," Talico said urgently, and Ember's voice died like she'd been shut off with a switch. "There's someone breaking into the house right at this second," Talico continued. "I think it's Natalie's ex-husband, John. You should get out of here as quickly as possible." Ember's eyes widened, but she didn't poof away immediately. Instead, she cut a look across the room, toward the desk drawer where the letters were hiding. She could hear faintly the sound of someone fiddling with the lock on the front door nearby. It would be only a matter of seconds before John made it inside the house. "Please, Ember," Talico urged. "There's still time to get away. He has a gun." Chapter 9. Ember, you have to leave now, Talico shouted. John's coming. Good, Ember replied. I think I ought to talk to him. He's been missing, and he's a prime suspect. Maybe I can get some good information. Talico didn't agree with Ember's reasoning. An angry man with a gun wasn't something he thought she needed to be dealing with, but he knew Ember wasn't going to budge on this one. She was far too stubborn. Talico knew a bad situation when he saw one and immediately left to go get help. John broke through the front door, gun in hand, and began walking into the house before he noticed Ember standing in the midst of the living room. Initially, John looked at her in bewilderment. He was clearly not expecting to find anyone in his dead ex-wife's house. John's surprise gave way to renewed anger, and he practically shouted when he asked Ember, "Who are you?" Wow, right to the point. I suppose that's fair. Ember shrugged her shoulders in feigned calm. In reality, she was incredibly tense, but she didn't want to upset a man holding a gun. She tried to keep her cool and responded, I'm Ember. I am, or I guess I was, a friend of Natalie's. Friend, huh? John said questioningly. I don't remember Natalie having any friends named Ember. You don't look familiar either. Natalie and I met after you two divorced, Ember replied. Our paths have never crossed before. Friend or not, John said. What are you doing here? Friends don't usually break into each other's houses. I'd say it's less suspicious than an ex-husband breaking in, Ember replied, her need to be snarky apparently stronger than her fear of John or his gun. John clearly didn't appreciate her tone. If he furrowed his brow anymore, his face might have collapsed in on itself. Noticing his distress, Ember spoke again, this time more serious. I'm sorry. Look, I'm trying to figure out what happened to Natalie. I thought there could be some clues here. What are you? John asked. Some kind of amateur detective or something? He scoffed, as if this was the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. I think you need to get out of my wife's house. Ex-wife, Ember reminded him. Even if I don't have a right to be here, I don't think you do either. John, angry that Ember pointed this out, held up his gun. He didn't directly seem to target her, but it was still too close for her comfort. I don't need you to remind me of my marital status, John said. Natalie was my wife, no matter what the courts say. Ember's heart was racing. She wanted to show a strong, stoic demeanor, if for no other reason than to keep John calm. She might have had the ability to protect herself from a bullet, but she wasn't exactly keen to find out. Ember was so scared, though, that she hadn't noticed when Talico left. Fortunately for Ember, Talico had gone to find Cedric. If Talico didn't have the power to protect Ember, he knew Cedric did. Cedric was sitting at his desk in the police station when Talico arrived. He had been endlessly poring over Natalie's case all day with no end in sight, and he was getting pretty drowsy. Just as Cedric's eyes grew too heavy for him to keep open any longer, Talico suddenly appeared in his office. Cedric! Talico shouted, shocking Cedric into wakefulness. What? What is it, Talico? Cedric asked. He could tell something was wrong from Talico's tone, and he was positive it had to do with Ember. Ember is in trouble, Talico told him as if reading his mind. She was checking out Natalie's house when the ex-husband showed up. He has a gun, and he looks determined. Cedric leapt from his chair, not even trying to respond to the ghost any further. He rushed past Talico and out the back door. In the back alley behind the station, Cedric transformed into his wolf form and began bounding toward Natalie's house as fast as his paws would carry him. Back at Natalie's house, Ember wasn't having much luck keeping John calm. The situation had escalated out of her control, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep this up. I don't care who you are, John shouted. Natalie was mine. You have no right to be here. Okay, Ember said. She was having trouble keeping her voice steady, but she tried her best. I understand. No, you don't, John said. We were working things out. The whole divorce. It was just a big misunderstanding. And now... John trailed off and looked off into the distance. Ember started to move, but the sound of her step brought back John's attention in full force. He took a step towards her. the gun now pointed directly at Ember. "What did you say your name was?" "Ember?" John asked. "That's right," Ember swallowed. "I really don't want any trouble, John. We both want to know what happened to Natalie, right?" "You don't know what I want." John started to step closer to Ember, expecting she would begin stepping back. Instead, she held her ground. John was obviously unstable, but she didn't want him cornering her, and she really didn't want her back turned towards him. Just as Ember was contemplating a safe way out of the situation, she heard the rapid gallop of a wolf approaching outside. Cedric. John started to take another step toward Ember, but before his foot touched the ground, Cedric pounced through the door and snarled at John. Ember breathed a sigh of relief. She was safe. Chapter 10. John stood, dumbstruck, staring at the massive wolf before him. It had been a while since Ember had last seen Cedric in his wolf form. She always felt so comfortable in Cedric's presence, regardless of his shape, that she had half forgotten how intimidating he could be like this. He was certainly intimidating now, filling up the doorway, hulking, huffing, with dark, shaggy fur and deadly eyes, not to mention the fangs and claws. And everything about his body language screamed that he was ready for a fight. John visibly deflated in the wolf's presence. The gun in his hands drooped, fell from where it had been aimed at Ember, and was now faced someplace near the wall to her left. She found it a lot easier to breathe now that there wasn't a gun pointed dead at her. Then, as John and Ember both looked on, the wolf's body began to change shape, the bones and skin kicking outward, morphing, the dense fur sinking inward and making way for human flesh. He stood on two legs and straightened, his uniform looking absurdly freshly pressed around him. Even to Ember, who had witnessed hundreds of shifts in her life, the sight was a shocking one. John, a mere human, was practically knocking his knees in fear and awe. "Put down your weapon," Cedric said. His voice was all professional calm, but Ember heard a little insistent, instinctive growl to it that let her know he was angry. John didn't have to be told twice. He bent to the ground, set down the gun, and then stepped away from it like he was afraid it might go off of its own volition. Now, taking in a deep breath, Cedric looked between Ember and John. "If you would both be so kind as to fill me in on why you seem to have broken into the home of a woman who's recently been murdered, I'd be greatly obliged." "I found something, Cedric," Ember said, breathless and eager. Now that her life wasn't being actively threatened, she found it much easier to get back into her spirit of enthusiasm for the case. "Right over on that desk." Cedric hesitated, then, being sure to keep a wary eye trained on John, crossed to the desk and looked down at the letter Ember had left open there. The one that read, "This isn't the end of it." He carefully prodded the envelope by the edge, turning it around so he could read the return address all the more easily. Then he looked sharply at John. "I'm sure you can tell me what this is about, can't you, Mr. Bailey?" John managed to pull himself together enough to answer. Ember appreciated that he had the decency to look ashamed of himself. "I was a fool," he said. "I didn't appreciate what I had. I got drunk one night when Natalie and I were still married, and I ended up committing an indiscretion." "You cheated on her," Ember accused. John glared at her before with an air of surrender, sighing and nodding. Having the living daylights frightened out of him had evidently made him considerably more cooperative. "Very well, if you must use such crass language. Yes, I did cheat on her. Natalie wasn't the type of woman who would stand for that kind of disrespect. She found out, of course she did, and she divorced me." "Good for her," Ember muttered. John flinched. Cedric gave Ember a warning look. Ember nodded, mouthed sorry at him, and mimed zipping her lips. "I was so heartbroken, so shocked and in denial, that I let her have everything. The house, the truck, even the dog, hoping she would see it as a sign that I still loved her, that she still mattered the most to me and forgive me. But she never did." "So you thought the best way to get your house back was to kill Natalie?" Ember asked, already forgetting her silent promise to keep quiet. Cedric rolled his eyes fondly. It was a losing battle, keeping Ember from jumping in. I would never hurt her, John objected. I loved her. Ember had heard this reasoning before from Darren. She was starting to get awfully tired of it. After all, men killed women they loved all the time. There were some very telling statistics to back that statement up that Ember figured it might be a good time to memorize. Cedric started to dig in his pocket. At first, John flinched, like he thought Cedric was going to withdraw his handcuffs. However, when Cedric walked over to John, it wasn't his handcuffs he held out, but rather his card. I'm going to need you to come by the station, just for questioning, all right? And for now, this house is off limits. It's still being investigated for evidence. He shot Ember a significant look as he said this. She needed to hear it, too. But she only nodded at John with smug conviction, so Cedric figured she must have considered herself a part of the official investigating for evidence process. John accepted the card and left. Ember was about to leap back in with questions for Cedric, but he silenced her with a grim look. No sooner had the door shut behind John than he spoke, not quite shouting, but certainly louder and more intense than usual. Why didn't you disappear? Once he came in, why did you stay? I wanted to talk to him, Ember said. I had questions about the case. You can't do that, he objected. You can't just put yourself in danger like that. She smiled and cocked her head, looking at him in the most curious way. It hit him right in the heart, that look, and he felt more winded by it than he had by the entire frantic run over here. Well, I knew if I was in real trouble you'd be able to come and save me, of course, she said. Then, with a giddy, impetuous flourish, she blew him a kiss and vanished into thin air. Chapter 11. Deputy Frank Bryant came into the Broken Broom after his shift late the next afternoon. Ember greeted him with a smile as he came up to eat at the bar. Let me guess, she said. The fried chicken plate. It was his absolute favorite. Sometimes he hemmed and hawed over the menu, pretending he was going to order something else that day. But he always ended up going with the chicken. And a beer, if it's not too early, he answered heavily. Always 5 o'clock somewhere, Ember said easily, handing a quickly scribbled order back to the kitchen and pulling a pint for him. How are you doing? You look a little rough, if you don't mind me saying so. Indeed, he had a drawn, grim look to him she'd never seen before from such an outwardly affable man. I am feeling rough, he admitted. It's all this business with Natalie. I just can't believe she's gone. I didn't realize you knew her, Ember said. Yeah, I used to stop by her convenience store every night, grab a soda, some snacks. He gave a sad smile. Highlight of my nights. But then we got closer once she filed that restraining order against Darren Cogdell. I dropped by a little more often to make sure she was safe. Caught Darren hanging around more than a couple times like that, so I was able to keep him out of her hair now and then. I wish I'd known her better, Ember admitted. Oh, she was impossible to dislike, Frank said. Once I got to hanging around her shop a little more, we got to be good friends. You know, most people around town think I'm a big old nerd, and I don't actually have many friends. My hobbies are even too nerdy for my own wife, to the point where we don't actually spend all that much time doing things together. But actually, Natalie and I had a lot of interests in common. Really? Ember asked. Like what? Ember was pleased to see Frank was smiling now as he reminisced. It was a sad smile, but it was better than the heavy, glum expression he'd worn when he walked in. Oh, lots of things. She had a dorky side that was just so charming. She was always telling this hokey little puns, and she loved Star Wars. Last spring, she gave me a May the 4th be with you pin on the 4th. Dared me to wear it on my uniform. Did you wear it? Ember asked, chuckled. Sure I did. At least until Sheriff Jameson gave me hell for dressing out of regulation. Then I kept it inside my pocket. He patted his breast pocket, then reached inside and pulled the pin out. Still keep it there. It's been run through the laundry a few times by now, of course. He smiled down at it fondly. Ember was starting to get the same distinct feeling about Frank as she got off of most of the men who had known Natalie. This woman had some kind of magical power where she attracted the wrong kind of man. Not that there was anything wrong with Frank as a person, at least not as far as Ember could tell. But he was married, and Ember wondered how Mrs. Bryant would have felt to hear her husband talking this way about another woman. She was dying to ask him if he'd wanted more out of his relationship with Natalie than just friendship. If so, that might have given him motive to want to harm her. Men didn't like when women said no to them, but of course she didn't have any basis at all for such an accusation. She was just casting around blindly, looking for anyone who might have had a grudge against Natalie. Just because someone knew her and had feelings for her didn't mean they'd killed her. And Frank claimed they were just good friends after all. Besides, it was probably bad form to go around accusing local deputies. He could almost certainly make Ember's life miserable if he chose to. After running his tab, Ember excused herself from where she'd been serving Frank at the bar, and after a while his lunch plate came out to him and he was eating on his own. He looked considerably sadder now than he had while they were chatting, but that couldn't be helped. He would be even sadder still if he cottoned on to the fact that Ember wanted to know if he was a murderer. Ember made sure she stayed busy with some other tables for a while so she wouldn't have to go back over and talk to him anymore. She wasn't sure she had the patience and tact to keep herself from pressing him with further questions about his relationship with Natalie. While Frank was still eating, Cedric walked into the pub. He smiled at Ember and approached her where she was bussing a recently abandoned booth. "This place is crawling with cops today," she said, nodding over at Frank. Frank was just finishing up his meal and rising from the bar. He turned and, glimpsing Cedric, gave him a brief nod, then left. Cedric watched bemused as his morose-looking deputy departed the bar. "What was that all about?" he asked. "He didn't look too well." Ember hesitated. She knew if she started opening up about what Frank had shared with her, then her whole convoluted and speculative theory would fall right out. Cedric would surely disapprove of the cynical, spurious turn her mind had taken. Besides, it was just a weird instinct she'd gotten while Frank was talking about his relationship with Natalie. It wasn't evidence, just a feeling. She shrugged. "I don't know." Cedric crossed his arms and gave her an unamused look. "You don't?" he asked, disbelieving. She threw up her hands. "Listen, it's not my place to tell you what's going on with your own deputy. If you're worried about him, you should ask him yourself." Chapter 12. "You have a minute?" Cedric asked, looking around the crowded pub. "A short one," Ember said, "possibly an interrupted one." She signaled to one of her waitresses who was clearing away a table across the room, mouthed and pointed to indicate that she would be back in the office if needed. The waitress gave her a thumbs up in acknowledgement. Cedric followed her back to the office. She was grateful to shut the door, blocking out some of the noise of the dining room. "What's up?" she asked, turning to him curiously. The office in the pub wasn't very large, and she had to kind of sidle past him to make her way over to her desk chair. "Some information on the case I thought you would be curious about," he said. "Details on the murder weapon." "The ice pick?" she asked, eyes lighting up. "You know, I've never seen someone get so excited while saying those particular words before," he said dryly, settling himself into the seat across the desk from Ember. "Yes, the ice pick. The lab says it's one of those fancy ones like they used to use back in the day." "What makes it fancy? I'm a little behind in my ice pick fashions." "Yeah, so am I. According to the text, it has something to do with the solid metal cast. Anyway, I guess this particularly one is considered an antique." "Interesting," Ember remarked softly. "So I guess the question is, which suspect would have an item like that?" Cedric shrugged. "It seems relatively innocuous. I'm not sure how much it communicates about the perpetrator." "That's just what I was worrying," Ember admitted. "Probably either Darren or John could have owned one. Even Natalie could have owned one, and the killer stole it from her." "Or it could be someone completely different?" Cedric agreed grimly. There was a depressing silence following this comment. Ember had been so excited to hear details about the murder weapon, but an ice pick was hardly a gun, with ballistics analysis that could help identify unique features or a serial number that could help trace it to its owner. An ice pick was just an ice pick, a slightly unexpected, strange, but in no way special object. Anyone could have owned this particular ice pick, and they could have gotten it from anywhere. Ember opened her mouth, then closed it again. Cedric raised an eyebrow, sensing she had something she wanted to say but wasn't sure how to say it. "Out with it," he said, going for gruff but landing far closer to gentle. "Okay, I wasn't going to tell you what Deputy Bryant was worried about, but I can't stop thinking about it," she said. "He was talking about Natalie, missing her and all that. I think her death has hit him really hard." "I'm sorry to hear that," Cedric said. Then, processing this information, he added, "Though I must admit I'm a little surprised. I didn't realize they were well acquainted." He said he stopped by her store a lot to check on her, particularly in the wake of Darren's restraining orders. "Yeah, that makes sense," Cedric remarked. "Now that you mention it, I remember that being part of his regular duties." "He also said he'd stop by more than just for that," Ember said. "Not even on duty, just to spend time with her." "I don't know, Cedric, I got this weird feeling, like the way he was talking about her. It almost seemed like he was in love with her." Cedric tensed. "If you're suggesting we should be thinking about Frank as a suspect?" Ember shrugged. "I don't know what I'm suggesting. I'm just conveying what I heard and the feeling it gave me." Cedric knew better than to dismiss Ember's feelings outright. She had very good intuition, and often her impressions of people were as guided by her special brand of magic as they were by her inherent empathy. Still, he wasn't happy. "I hate to think that one of my deputies could do something like that," he admitted, and Ember's face fell. "But I will think about it. I promise." Ember looked a little heartened by that, but still glum. "I trust your judgment of character," Cedric said. "After all, you put up with me, don't you?" At least that got a smile out of her. Once Cedric left the office, Ember knew she ought to get back out onto the floor. Still, judging from the level of noise she could hear through the office door, she thought it seemed like the lunch crowd was thinning, which meant things would be pretty slow for the next few hours before the dinner and drinks parties started pouring in. Her servers and kitchen staff could probably do without her oversight for another couple minutes, and she was dying to get her thoughts out on paper. Maybe it would help her feel more methodical and organized about all of the swirling mess of thoughts and information she'd been swimming through since this whole ordeal began. So she withdrew a sheet of paper and started to jot down the names of all her suspects. Darren Cogdell, John Bailey. And now, because she simply couldn't shake the thought, she added Frank Bryant to the list. Ember had the feeling all three of these men had truly loved Natalie. It seemed Natalie was an incredibly lovable woman. Not only was she beautiful, and not only had she always struck Ember as perfectly friendly and pleasant, but the image of the woman she had been that Ember had gleaned from these last few days' investigations made her appreciate Natalie for her intelligence, her passion, her sense of fun and self-respect. In a perfect world, a woman like that would never be in danger from the men who loved her. But Ember knew that love could be a powerful motivator for all kinds of horrible actions. Looking at the list of names she had made, conjuring up the mental image of first one man, then the next, Ember thought that the question at the heart of the case boiled down to one thing. How far would someone go for love? Chapter 13. Once the lunch crowd died down, one of the waitresses came to rap at the office door. "Would it be all right if we took our break now?" she asked. "The place is dead for right now, and the other girls and I were thinking of running out for some sandwiches." "Sure," Ember said. "Take your time even. Just be back by the dinner rush, all right?" Which left Ember to hold down the fort. Honestly, she was grateful for the opportunity to leave her infuriating list of suspects. She didn't like not knowing which of them was the person who killed Natalie, or even if it was one of those three. They would need more information about all three men before they could really figure out what had happened, but Ember had an impatient itch that made it feel nearly impossible to keep on with this horrible waiting. It really was dead in the dining area. There were a couple of what looked like college-age girls seated at a booth near the window with their laptops out, sipping lattes and typing furiously, and one of the local library workers was seated off in the corner on her own, with a book cracked open at the spine. None of them so much as looked up at Ember as she walked around the empty room, pushing in chairs. She almost would have preferred the restaurant to be busy. That at least would have given her something to do to take her mind off the case. In her sense of frustration, she decided maybe now was the right time to take a break from thinking about what had happened to Natalie. She had been meaning to give the kitchen a good scrubbing, and now was as good a time as any to get started. Kaylee joined her as soon as she entered the kitchen. "What are you doing?" "Cleaning." Kaylee gave her a curious look. "You know the kitchen workers wiped the place down before they left." "I'm deep cleaning," she said, snapping on a pair of rubber gloves and grabbing the nearest mop. "Oh no," Kaylee said. "This is serious." Just then, Sage flapped up to the nearby window, her wings banging up against the glass, knocking to get in. Ember removed one glove and pushed the window open. Sage landed delicately on the counter, then morphed suddenly into human shape, still seated on the countertop. "That's not hygienic," Ember said, scooching her friend off the counter and rapidly spraying cleaner and wiping it up where Sage had been. "And a friendly hello to you too," Sage said, smiling. "My day has been lovely. Thank you. And yours?" "She's deep cleaning," Kaylee warned. Sage grimaced. "Oh no. That bad, is it?" She turned to Ember, who was dutifully trying to ignore her friend's teasing. "Is it about the case?" "I'm just taking a little think break right now," Ember said. "Usually a think break is ice cream and a movie with your buddy," Sage objected, pointing both thumbs at herself. "All she ever wants to watch is romantic comedies," Kaylee opined. "We've had that Alexander the Great documentary series queued up for ages, but somehow it's never my turn to choose." "You choose when you pay rent," Ember muttered. "You should be relaxing," Sage insisted. "I can't relax," Ember said. "If I relax, I start thinking about the case again. I need something to help me clear my head of all that." "You know, you wouldn't have to do all this to clear your head if you had a boyfriend." Ember threw up her hands. "Please, not this today." "A boyfriend," Sage continued, talking over Ember's objections, "would be able to take you out. Movies, dinner, theater, hikes." "Hikes?" Kaylee asked with distaste. "Well, maybe not hikes. Little hikes. Flat, pleasant hikes, full of beautiful nature and animals, and not much breathless climbing of mountains, that sort of thing." Sage paused thoughtfully. "Maybe I'm thinking of a boat ride." "Why would I want all that when I have my catty, batty friends to talk to?" Ember asked with a cheeky smirk. Sage and Kaylee both rolled their eyes in unison. "We're talking about Cedric, dummy," Sage said affectionately. "You know you're into him, and you also know he's into you. Why not make it official? I'm sure he's dying to show you a good time, and you look like you could use an actual break, not just a clean the kitchen break." Ember blushed. "Come on. Of course I like Cedric, but he just got out of a 7-year relationship not long ago. Poor guy is probably gun-shy. I don't want to rush him." Sage pouted, which Ember took as a victory. Sage only pouted when she was forced to drop a subject because she'd lost the argument. "Fine," Sage said eventually. "If you won't ask Cedric out again, then the least you can do is tell me if you've figured out anything else about the case yet." "No," Ember said sorrowfully. "I think the only thing I've figured out is that love really truly sucks." "It does seem to get a lot of people killed," Kaylee remarked. "Come on now," Sage objected. "Love's not so bad." Just then, there was a distinct flicker of light in the kitchen, just between where Ember was standing by the sink and where Kaylee and Sage were ranged over by the refrigerator. Ember was finally growing accustomed enough to Ghost's appearances that she knew to expect Talako when he materialized a second later. What she didn't expect was that he wouldn't be alone. Next to him, gazing at him with an unmistakably adoring expression on her face, was the very ghostly, very attractive shape of Natalie Gordon. Sage and Kali also took a beat to recover from the sudden apparition. Predictably, Sage got her voice back first. "CM," she said, turning to Ember and gesturing with both hands at the ghostly couple. "Even Talako can get a date." Chapter 14. Talako smiled patiently at Sage's comment. However, Ember thought he did seem a little more flustered than his usual stoic self. Evidently, even Talako wasn't unaffected by the considerable beauty of the gorgeous, voluptuous Natalie Gordon. Although she looked slightly different in ghost form, Ember had to admit. Luckily, she wasn't permanently marred in the spirit world by the wound that had killed her living body. Her head was perfectly intact and unmarked. However, the diaphanous light that made up her shape and image had turned her once strawberry blonde hair slightly gold, and her brown eyes had turned honey-colored. It only made her look more stunning, of course. "Natalie," Ember said gratefully, "it's so good to see you. Thank you for coming." "Thanks to Talako," Natalie said, practically beaming at him. "I was having difficulty materializing. After I felt your magic reaching out for me, Ember, I could manage it in little bursts. That was how I appeared to your and your friend that first time, and to you and Darren after that." Ember remembered that she had meditated after learning about Natalie's death to try to tap into the spirit world for answers. She thought no one had felt her. Evidently, Natalie had. But then Talako managed to find me, and he helped me learn how to take this shape. Natalie beamed, threw out her arms, and turned in a circle, a graceful ghost's glide, her legs unmoving. "Isn't it wonderful?" "You look great," Sage said helpfully. "I hope I look that good when I'm dead." Ember worried the remark might hurt Natalie's feelings, but she seemed relatively unbothered by it. "I'm sure Talako has already told you," Ember said, "but I'm trying to help figure out what happened to you. Is there anything you can tell us? Anything you remember?" Sometimes, especially in the wake of sudden and traumatic deaths, spirits weren't able to remember much about their last few minutes of life. Natalie pressed her mouth into a grim, apologetic line and shook her head. "It's not that I don't remember. I know exactly where I was standing in the shop, the last thing I was looking at. A display of batteries, of all things. But the person attacked from behind." "You didn't hear them coming up on you?" Kaylee asked. Another shake of the head. "That doesn't mean anything, though. I'm off in my own little world most of the time, and customers just come and go. It's not like I take note of every single person who comes in or out." "Anything you might remember could be of help," Ember prompted. Natalie paused, thinking. Slowly, she said, "Just something I sensed. I guess it was the angle of attack. I couldn't name how I know it or anything." "It's all right," Talako said. "You don't have to prove anything. Leave that to us. Even impressions can be helpful." "I had a feeling the attacker was my size, or at least not much taller than I am, and right before I died I felt this sharp, sudden pain in my ear." She reached a hand up to the side of her head, wincing at the memory. "Do you happen to own an ice pick, particularly one you kept around the store?" Natalie looked at Ember, surprised. "An ice pick? That's what it was?" "Ouch." She winced again. "No, I don't have one. Not as far as I know. Kind of old-fashioned, aren't they? I think my mother-in-law kept some around. Ex-mother-in-law, I mean." "She did?" Natalie nodded. "She collected antique utensils and other kitchen doodads." "Where does she live?" Natalie raised her eyebrows. "She and John's dad live out on Coomber Road, where it meets up with Oak. Big greenhouse right at that corner." "Why?" None of the others in the room were asking why, though. Sage, Kaylee, and Talako were all giving Ember a knowing look. "I thought you were taking a break from the case," Kaylee said teasingly. "I was," Ember said. "I am. But by the time John's parents are asleep tonight, I think I might be ready to jump back into the investigations." At 11 o'clock that night, Ember, Kaylee, and Sage sat in Ember's car at the corners of Coomber and Pine. The house was exactly as Natalie had described it, tall and dark and old-fashioned, backlit by the moon like a dramatic stage light. Ember took the precaution of driving out to it to check that all the lights in all the windows were off. They were. Natalie had even given Ember a rundown of the interior layout to help her prepare for what she was going to find inside. "Be careful," Sage whispered as Ember prepared to poof inside. "Be clever," Kaylee reminded her. "Don't be ridiculous," she told them. "First sign of trouble, I'll come right out and Sage will drive us off." Then, before either of them could offer her any more advice, she screwed up her nose and appeared dead in the center of the gloomy old living room. Natalie had warned her it would be cluttered, but the word hadn't quite prepared Ember for what she found here. It wasn't so much clutter as it was overabundance. The Bailey family was clearly incredibly well off, and they didn't mind showing it in that prideful old money way some Louisiana families like to do. There was classy, old-styled furniture set up into little pods everywhere, breaking up the space and making it difficult to see and navigate in the dark. Nearly every surface was bustling with tasteful tableaux of valuable little curios. Almost as soon as she had entered the space, Ember knocked one of these tables with her hip and sent a little ceramic figurine wobbling. She managed to catch it with her magic before it went smashing against the floor. She set it carefully and precisely back in what she hoped had been its previous place. So grateful was she about managing not to smash the figurine, however, that she wasn't paying attention at her next step, and she ran her shoulder heavily into the nearby wall. She felt a queasy, seismic shift, and suddenly a great framed picture came leaping off its nail and crashed to the floor with the unmistakable cry of broken glass. Faster than she would have expected, what seemed like every light upstairs came on. Then, to Ember's surprise, the light in the room where she was standing suddenly blinked to life, and she could see with perfect clarity everything that surrounded her. She heard footsteps on the stairs, and she could just make out the outline of a man rushing down, shotgun in hand, before she managed to poof out of the house and back into the car again. "That was quick," Kaylee remarked dryly. Sage didn't even wait for Ember to finish buckling up before she started the engine and drove away. Chapter 15. Be clever. Kaylee's advice was what really stung, as Ember tried to recover her nerves and pride after the crushing failure of the previous night. There was nothing clever about jumping feet first into the middle of a house she knew nothing about. Sure, it was often a very useful strategy, but it was more a brute force approach than anything else. Today, she had a different plan. She woke up early, long before she usually left for the pub, and started to get ready. "You're not trying Natalie's in-laws' place again, are you?" Kaylee asked sleepily from where she was curled near the foot of the bed. "Yes," Ember said, "but this time I'm going to think smart." "That's my girl," Kaylee said, suddenly alert and up on her 4 feet. "Do you want me to come along with you?" "If you'd like." So the two of them went out to the car and once again drove out to the Bailey's house. It was less intimidating by day, but only a little. After compelling Kaylee to stay in the car, the tack she was about to take would be considerably hindered by a cat hanging around. Ember approached the door and knocked. It was John's mother who answered. Thank goodness. Ember had been having nightmares about Mr. Bailey and that shotgun. Ember smiled brightly. "Hello, we haven't met before. My name is Ellen. I'm an antiques dealer around these parts." Mrs. Bailey looked surprised but gave a polite smile. "Oh, yes?" "Yes, I'm sorry to burst in on you like this, I know it's early. But I heard from one of the women in the Historical Society, Yolanda? You know her, don't you? That you collect antique ice picks. Best collection in the county, she said." Mrs. Bailey smiled, looking a little confused. Ember wasn't sure if there was a Yolanda in the Historical Society, but evidently Mrs. Bailey wasn't sure either. "Of course," said Mrs. Bailey. "I have some very special pieces. I didn't realize the Historical Society knew about them. Would you like to see them? I keep them just in here." She pointed back behind her, into the house. "That would be lovely," Ember said eagerly. So Mrs. Bailey let Ember inside. Ember noticed with a bashful feeling that the large picture she had knocked had been replaced on the wall, but all the glass of the frame was missing. Probably it had taken a long time to clean up all those many pieces. "My name is Anna, by the way," Mrs. Bailey was saying. "It's nice to meet you, Ember. I'm always so pleased to know young people such as yourself who are interested in antiques." "Oh, yes," Ember answered. "I love them." She really hoped Anna didn't start to try to test her knowledge. She could tell most woods apart from one another, and she was known to watch an antiques roadshow now and then, but if she was asked anything about something's era, she might have to make a break for it all over again. It feels like a different world now, with all these gadgets. But back when I was growing up, my mother and grandmother instilled in me the value of a simple, well-made implement. I've appreciated old things ever since. I feel as though they were built to last in a way that doesn't happen anymore, don't you? Anna led her to another room, opened that housed an elaborate armoire. She pulled open the topmost drawer. Inside, delicately set against a velvety drawer liner, someone had ranged a variety of old but well-maintained implements, elegant scissors and hand mirrors and the like. There, in the nearest right-hand corner, were what must have been a dozen ice picks. "Wow," Ember said. "These are amazing." "Aren't they?" Anna said fondly. She touched one lightly, and it twitched in its bed. "I've been keeping my eye out for nice specimens for a long time now." "This is the whole collection. There aren't any missing." Anna blinked curiously at the ice picks. Then she counted them slowly and hummed, curious. "There might be one missing, now that you mention it. Do you happen to know when it might have disappeared?" Anna looked at Ember, eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm not sure. It must have been here at least a week ago. I cleaned them all myself then. But someone did break into my house last night, knocked all sorts of things over. I'm still picking up the pieces from that fiasco." She was still watching Ember, not quite accusatory but clearly curious, calculating. Ember had the distinct sense that she needed to get out of there, and fast. "Well?" Anna asked a little too carefully. "Was Yasmin right? Is it the best collection in the county?" She'd used the wrong name on purpose, Ember just knew it. She was trying to catch Ember in a lie. "Yasmin?" Ember echoed, confused. "Oh, you mean Yolanda?" "Yes, she was absolutely right. These are completely captivating. If you're ever interested in selling, just talk to Jerry at Times Treasures." It was one of the better local antiques shops. Ember knew Jerry well because he came into the pub so often. "Give him my name. He'll know how to reach me." Hopefully he won't blab to her that I'm not actually an antiques dealer, Ember thought nervously. She made a mental note to call Jerry and give him a heads up. Meanwhile, Ember was actively backing away. Anna didn't walk her to the front door, simply watched her until Ember had turned the corner and slipped out of sight. When Ember did leave the house, she did it at half a run, trotting all the way out to the car. Kaylee perked up as Ember slid into the driver's seat. "How did it go? Did she believe you?" "No," Ember said, anxiously starting up the car, eager to get far, far away from there, fast. "No, I really don't think she did." Chapter 16. Ember absent-mindedly wiped and re-wiped a rag on the bar. Even though she was physically at the broken broom, her mind was on Natalie and the ice pick. Certainly John could have stolen one from Anna, but anyone could have. It was far from concrete evidence. Ember was so lost in thought that she didn't notice the customer approaching from the front door. "Ahem," the woman coughed politely to get Ember's attention. Ember, shocked out of her thought process, dropped the rag and looked up at the woman. "Oh, hello," Ember said, a bit embarrassed. "Sorry, just lost in thought. How can I help you?" "It's no trouble, sweetie." The woman smiled. "I was just wondering, do you sell orders to go?" Ember smiled back. "Of course, just give me 1 second." She dropped the rag into the small bucket of sanitizer water behind the bar and went to the sink to wash her hands. She returned to the woman, ready to take her order. "What can I get started for you?" Ember asked. "I'd like 2 orders of fried chicken, please," responded the customer. Excellent choice, Ember commended. She probably would have said this about anything the woman ordered, but the fried chicken at the Broken Broom was especially tasty. Anything else? Asked Ember. No, I think that'll do it, said the woman. All right, Ember said. Let me just get this to the cook and we can get squared away. Ember walked back to the kitchen and told the chef they needed 2 orders of fried chicken, packed to go. When Ember returned to the bar, the customer had sat down at one of the empty bar stools. It was early evening in the middle of the week, so most of the bar stools were empty. It'll be up in about 15 minutes, Ember told the customer. Can I get you something to drink while you wait? No, that's quite all right, the customer responded. How much do I owe you? Ember wrote up the tab and handed it over to the customer, who promptly returned it with more than enough cash to cover the bill. You can keep what's left, sweetie, the woman said to Ember as she handed her back the check. Thank you very much, Ember replied. After she took care of the bill, Ember grabbed her rag once more and began wiping the counter closer to where the woman sat. Having something to do, no matter how pointless, made small talk easier. Before Ember had the chance to start with the usual spiel, though, the customer spoke up. My husband cannot stop talking about how good your fried chicken is here. I'm so happy I finally get to try it. Oh, yeah? Ember replied. Does your husband come in often? Probably more than he should, the woman said and chuckled. He's Frank Bryant, the deputy? She said questioningly, hoping the detail would help Ember remember. Of course, said Ember. Frank's in here all the time. That must mean you're Sarah, right? That's right, Sarah said. I hope you've only heard good things. Only the best, Ember said with a grin. How is Frank? I haven't seen him in a while. Sarah's smile faded just slightly. Yes, he's been home more often than before. His friend died, and I think it's made him do some thinking. Sarah's gaze shifted from Ember to somewhere far off in the distance. Yeah, Ember responded. I know he had been close with Natalie. How is Frank holding up? Sarah's eyes snapped back to Ember and she said, Well, he's sad, you know, but if I'm being honest, I don't know that I can say the same. Confused at the admission, Ember asked, What do you mean? Not that I'm not sad someone died, Sarah backtracked. I'm just happy Frank isn't spending all of his time with her anymore. I missed my husband. Tears began to well in Sarah's eyes. Before they could grow, Sarah quickly wiped them away with the back of her hand. We weren't exactly doing well before, Sarah continued. Our marriage was pretty strained. I don't know what I would have done if I'd lost him. Ember, unsure of how to respond to such a personal admission, just smiled and nodded. A bartender's job was to listen and only offer advice when it was needed. Orders up, the chef called out from the order window. Grateful that the end of the conversation was in sight, Ember turned and grabbed the Togo containers before loading them into a bag. She set the bag on the counter in front of Sarah and smiled at her once more. Thank you so much, sweetie, Sarah said as she grabbed the bag, for the food and for listening. It was obvious she had teared up, but not so much that she wouldn't be able to hide it from Frank before she got home. No problem, Sarah, responded Ember. Send Frank my best, okay? Maybe you two can come in and eat here together sometime. Yes, Sarah said. That would be nice. Later in the evening, Ember sat at the bar and tabulated the tips for the day. They were closing in about 30 minutes, and she wasn't really expecting a customer this late on a weeknight. Someone did come in, though. Hearing the door, Ember neatly put away the cash and walked behind the counter. Ember was about to ask the man what she could get for him when she realized that it was none other than John Bailey, Natalie's ex. John was clearly upset about something. He got straight to the point. Did you visit my mother? What? Ember asked, trying her best to look genuinely confused. Why would I visit your mother? Because, John said, a vein near his temple pulsing. She said she had a strange visitor that sounded an awful lot like you. Look, John, Ember replied. She was happy to have the bar between her and John this time. I don't know what idea you have in your head, but I never saw your mother. I don't even know who your mom is. John clearly didn't believe Ember, but he didn't want a repeat of the incident at Natalie's house. Just stay away from her, okay? John said threateningly. I'll try, Ember said, shrugging, but it'll be hard. Like I said, I don't know who your mother is. Angry at Ember's laissez-faire attitude, John slammed a fist on the bar counter hard enough to shake the glasses at the other end. Stay away from my mother, he repeated, or else. With that, John stormed out of the broken broom. Ember stood in stunned silence. She could understand why Natalie had left her husband. Chapter 17. The next day passed in a relatively normal way, and Ember was grateful to be getting to the dinner hour without any ghosts, stalkers, or ex-husbands coming along to make her day more difficult. She was also grateful for the opportunity to think through what she knew about the case. She'd been chewing it over all day, trying to figure things out. All three men, Darren Cogdell, John Bailey, and Deputy Frank Bryant, knew about each other. That was interesting and potentially relevant knowledge to have, but Ember couldn't quite figure out its meaning just yet. Unless, of course, it meant that two or more of them had been working together. Ember couldn't picture Darren scheming with other men on something like this. He had a real loner energy. But John and Frank knowing each other might be something. Natalie was causing trouble with Frank's marriage. John wanted his house back. If they'd collaborated, John could have found out from Frank what law enforcement would have been around the store and when. After all, Frank probably was the law enforcement that would have been around that night. Not to mention that, in his line of work, Frank quite possibly knew how to clean up a crime scene. John, for his part, was an IT specialist. Ember didn't know much about security camera closed-circuit systems, but she figured someone in John's position, with his insights and professional expertise, probably would. He might have been able to take out the cameras without being spotted. No matter how many times she ran the scenario through her mind, she couldn't credit either Frank or John with the skills necessary to handle the elaborate plan's many stages on their own. Put them together, and each man's presence in the scheme accounted for the other man's shortcomings. If they'd been working in concert, they definitely could have handled the job. Penny for your thoughts? Kaylee asked from under the bar, where she was curled up half on top of the big calculator Ember used sometimes to double-check the computer's numbers at the end of most nights. It looked to Ember like a distinctly uncomfortable perch, but Kaylee seemed content enough where she was. Oh, Ember said with a sigh. I'm just kicking around a theory, thinking about what it would mean if John Bailey and Deputy Bryant worked together to kill Natalie. Over the next 10 minutes, in between pausing to serve customers who came up to the bar and helping her waitresses whenever they needed drinks orders filled, Ember spelled out her tentative conclusions to Kaylee. Kaylee appeared to be barely listening, her eyes scarcely open, but Ember knew she was taking it all in carefully. That's an interesting theory, Kaylee remarked when Ember had finished. You're right that it covers some of the previous holes. But do you have any information to back it up? Have you really gotten an idea of how well those two know each other? Looks like I'm about to get a golden opportunity to ask about it, Ember said, gazing across the restaurant floor to the front door, which was just at that moment opening to reveal a haggard-looking Frank Bryant. He was still dressed in his uniform, but he had removed his badge, so he must have just gotten off shift. Ember wondered if he was meeting anyone. Otherwise, why would he be coming to the pub instead of heading home to his wife, especially if his marriage had really gone through such a rocky patch recently? But no, Frank appeared to be planning to drink alone again tonight. He walked up to the bar, greeting Ember with a short nod, and sat at a stool near the end. She pretended to busy herself with a little tidying before heading over for a chat. She didn't want to make him feel like he was about to be pounced on. Hey, she said. Tough day? He let out a rueful huff of air. I've had worse. Yeah, I'll bet. What can I get you? Oh, just whatever's good on tap. He dug for his wallet. I'm just grabbing a quick one before heading home. She pulled the drink for him, then set it on a flimsy coaster in front of where he sat. You know, I met your wife yesterday, she said, smiling. She seems nice. Frank, who had lifted the glass to take in a long drink as soon as it was set in front of him, blinked in disorientation as he gulped, as though he couldn't figure out for a second who Ember was talking about. Oh, he said after a beat. Sarah. Yeah, she's nice. Makes me think about poor John Bailey, Ember said, as casually as she could manage, keeping a careful eye trained on Frank for his reaction. I mean, I know he and Natalie were divorced, but still, it must be devastating, losing someone you loved like that. Frank took another drink, non-committal. Do you know John, by the way? He shrugged. Yeah, I do. Ember forced a smile. What are your impressions of the guy, if you don't mind my asking? It seemed like Natalie was pretty afraid of him. Frank shook his head. You're barking up the wrong tree. I mean, sure, Natalie was scared of John. They had stuff between them, and that was personal. But I know John's a good guy. How do you know? He paused before answering, then drank his beer nearly all the way down in one long gulp, like he was sick of this and getting ready to leave. Look, she'd divorced him. He was hurt by that. He wasn't hurt enough to murder, just hurt enough to be displeased. Displeased how? This time he managed to drain the glass entirely. Then he took a 10 out of his wallet and tossed it on the bar. You ought to look elsewhere for a suspect, Ember, and that's all I'll tell you. He rose from his stool and abruptly turned to leave. Chapter 18. Ember wanted to take her theories and go to Cedric. She didn't have anything worth bringing him as far as evidence went, but she liked to talk things through with him whenever she got the chance. She found he often had a perspective that helped her clear her mind and see connections she might have missed otherwise. Maybe you should do a little more research before you to-go him, Kaylee suggested when Ember brought up her plans that night after closing. Have you tried searching their names together online? Do you really think the internet will be able to tell me outright how two men might know each other? Ember asked. You'd be surprised. I'm not sure how Sun Tzu would feel about relying on the internet for knowing the enemy. Sun Tzu was nothing if not eminently practical, Kaylee said archly. He would have been a proponent of using any and all resources at hand for intel and reconnaissance. She had already convinced Ember. As soon as the pub closing duties were finished, they went together back into the office to search using the old office computer. And the computer was old. Everything took ages to load. Ember had been planning to buy a faster one, but the truth was that she didn't really use the computer for very much more than basic pub maintenance work, and the old dinosaur did well enough when it came to ordering kegs, so the question of replacing it had never felt particularly urgent. It was feeling urgent enough now. She'd searched the names John Bailey and Frank Bryant together, as well as Couchemar just for good measure, since both men had relatively common names, and the results page was taking what felt like forever to load. Ember felt her attention span starting to drift when Callie piped up from her lap saying, Look, that first one, click that. Ember did. Slowly, what looked like a Couchemar High School sports photography archive loaded. There were a few action shots of the local football team from what must have been at least 10 years ago, possibly more like 15. Evidently some year when they'd had a winning season, so it must have been a while back. At first, she didn't see why this had been the first result under her search parameters, but as she scrolled down the page, she saw what portion was highlighted from her search. It was the caption underneath a team photo. The caption declared that the team had made it to the semifinals. In the photograph, a bunch of high school boys in hulking uniforms and intimidating helmets were ranged in two lines, one standing in back and the other kneeling in front. John's and Frank's names were both listed as standing in the back line. Ember scanned the faces, having to squint a little to be able to see through the bars on their football helmets, but eventually she found them, shoulder to shoulder off to the right of the frame. Their arms were flung around each other's shoulders and they were both grinning. They look close, Kaylee said. It looks that way. A little more digging through Couchemar High's online archives confirmed that the two had been in high school at the same time, had been photographed together as members of the team a handful of times, almost always near to each other. One news article that had been excerpted in an archived yearbook page even talked about how well Bryant and Bailey's collaboration on the field worked for the team as a whole, claiming that they must have been able to read each other's minds. Another result the search engine had kicked up was from some sort of reunion event, which had brought the players of that winning season back together for a meal in celebration and commemoration. The article covering the reunion contained a quote from Bryant. Bryant, now a Couchemar police deputy, insists he maintains a close connection with his friends from the team. John Bailey and I are still good friends, says Bryant, and I'll meet up with some of the other guys for beers now and then. This would have been after the divorce, Kaylee remarked. They were friends all the way from football in high school through John's divorce from Natalie. That wasn't how Frank made it sound, Ember said. When he explained his friendship with Natalie, he didn't mention any of this. How he probably would have known her pretty well before he started hanging around her shop to keep Darren away. Why had Frank really been visiting Natalie? All that night and much of the next day, Ember spent what spare moments she had reaching out to try to locate Talico. It would have been a huge help to be able to talk all of this through with Natalie, but Natalie hadn't appeared in a while. It seemed like wherever Talico was, he couldn't hear Ember's call either. Kaylee had been gone most of the day, which meant that Ember was mostly alone with her own thoughts. She was considering giving Sage a call, seeing if she wanted to drop by after lunch, when Callie came trotting in, slipping unnoticed through the front door as some customers were leaving. Breathless with excitement, Kaylee rounded the bar and approached Ember. "What is it?" Ember asked. "What happened?" "I was just walking out in the woods nearby," she said, practically bursting with the news. "And that lake, you know the one, a little southeast of here? Well, I was going to see if I could catch a fish or two for a little light meal. You know how peckish I get." "Kaylee," Ember said sharply. Yes, very well. So who should I see but a certain deputy talking with John Bailey out by the water?" Ember gasped. "They're meeting together to talk?" she asked. "That seems shady. What were they saying?" "Alas," Kaylee said, "they were standing very near that horrible thorny, swampy area on the northern bank. I couldn't get close enough to figure out what they were talking about. But surely that's not something a deputy is supposed to be doing with a suspect in a murder case, is it? Meeting clandestinely in the woods?" "No," Ember said. "It isn't. I'll call Cedric and see if he can talk now." But Cedric wasn't picking up his phone. "He must be busy," Ember muttered, tucking her phone away in her pocket. She considered texting him the information, but instead she decided it would be better to wait until he called her back. Chapter 19. Hours later, Cedric still hadn't called Ember back. She kept impatiently looking at her phone as if she were willing it to ring. Finally, the screen lit up and Cedric's name appeared. Ember picked it up before the first ring had ended. "Cedric, where have you been?" Ember asked accusingly. She wanted to tell him everything she had just found out, and time was of the essence. "Ember, I've been working," Cedric said, a mixture of both humor and apology in his voice. He was sure what Ember had to say was important, but she should understand better than most that he was a busy man. I know, Ember replied hurriedly, "but this is important." "What is it?" Cedric asked. "I found some interesting information about John." Ember paused. "And Frank." "Frank?" Cedric questioned. "You mean Frank Bryant?" Ember stayed quiet for a moment. Accusing a police deputy of murder wasn't exactly easy, and doing so directly to the sheriff made it 10 times harder. Ember almost whispered her response. "Yes," she said. Sensing Ember's unease, Cedric humored her. "All right, I'm listening." Ember went on to tell everything she had recently learned about Frank and his long-standing friendship with Natalie's ex-husband, John. After listening intently to everything Ember had to say, Cedric spoke up. "Okay, I can see why you're suspicious." "Thank you." Ember was happily surprised that Cedric had taken her seriously. "But," Cedric cautioned, "that doesn't mean I think anything will come of it. I've known Frank for a long time, and I kind of have a nose for these things." True, but Ember tried to say before Cedric continued. I'm not saying it's impossible, just highly unlikely. Frank isn't just my deputy. He's also my friend. Cedric paused to wait for Ember's response. When none came, he sighed and went on. You're my friend too, Ember, so I'll look into this for you. Just don't expect much, okay? Ember was torn. Obviously, she understood Cedric's position, but that didn't mean she wasn't bothered by his lackadaisical attitude about her suspicion. Begrudgingly, Ember responded. Okay, Cedric, she said. I trust you. That evening, Ember was spending her time at the Broken Broom. There had been a rush as people started getting out of work, but things had slowed down considerably. As Ember was walking back to the bar from a nearby table, she noticed that a customer had snuck in and was patiently waiting at the counter for her order to be taken. I'll be right with you, Ember said to the woman's back. No rush, said Sarah Bryant as she turned on the bar stool. Ember smiled at Sarah, but something felt off about the way Sarah was looking at her. A few minutes later, after Ember had finished dropping off an order for another customer, she walked behind the counter and approached Sarah. Hi, Sarah, Ember said with her best customer service voice. Nice to see you again. The fried chicken was good enough that you came back for more? Sarah grinned, her lips pointed and sour. No, I just wanted to come in for a drink. And to talk. Sure, Ember said. She didn't necessarily want to talk to Sarah, but she was very aware that bartenders are often the cheapest therapists. Let's start with the drink. Just something simple, Sarah responded. I'll have an extra dry gin martini. Shaken, not stirred? Ember asked in her best Bond impression. Oh God, no, said Sarah, offended. You'll ruin it. Ember was taken aback at Sarah's seriousness, but she kept her face plastered with a smile. Of course, sure. Ember proceeded to make the drink, being careful to be extra gentle as she stirred the gin with ice and just a drop of vermouth. Ember set the martini glass in front of Sarah and delicately poured the cocktail. While she did this, Sarah revealed her real reason for visiting the Broken Broom that evening. So, Sarah began, her voice rather accusatory, have you seen my husband lately? Ember dropped an olive in the drink and began cleaning up while she responded. Yeah, I think he's come in a couple of times. She tried her best to remain calm and non-committal. What was Sarah getting at? Oh, okay, said Sarah. It was obvious she expected more of a response from Ember. When she didn't get one, she went on. Frank's been... Sarah started, stopped, and then tried again. It's just... This wouldn't be the first time he's... strayed. Sarah emphasized the last word. When Ember didn't say anything, Sarah chuckled and kept going. I'm always cleaning up after him, Sarah said into her drink. She hadn't looked at Ember since she mentioned Frank. This caught Ember's attention, and she could tell Sarah wanted her to ask. What do you mean? Oh, you know. Sarah finally looked up. Just talk to him, and them. I made sure everyone involved understood what would happen if things kept up that way. Her eyes bored into Ember's skull. Ember just stared at Sarah. She wasn't sure how to respond, but it was obvious Sarah thought she was one of these them that needed a talking to. I'm still not sure I follow, Ember replied defensively. But, she said before Sarah could say more, I'm sure you did what you had to do. It sounds like you're a great wife. Sarah flashed that sickly sweet grin again before responding, I try. She whipped a $20 bill from her purse and dropped it next to her barely touched martini. Well, said Sarah as she got up, thanks for talking with me. I hope we have an understanding. Before Ember could respond, Sarah walked away and left the Broken Broom. Wow, said Ember to herself. She threw out the drink and tossed the glass in a dish bin before dropping the 20 in the register. Ember might have thought more about Sarah and her strange ways, but she was distracted. All she could think about was Frank and John and their secret meeting. Chapter 20. When he got a spare moment later in the day, Cedric swung by the broken broom to touch base with Ember. He wasn't convinced she'd been too receptive to his line of reasoning earlier, and he wanted to check in and make sure she was handling everything all right. She had a tendency to get wholly, head-achingly invested in things she was passionate about, to the extent where she occasionally stopped taking care of herself as well as she should. It had been that way since they were kids, and he'd witnessed her going through something like that when the earlier case had come up, and Ember and her pub were implicated in a few local deaths. He didn't want her having to go through all that again. The broken broom was about half full when he entered, and there was none of that rushed air that came from the mealtime surges. People were talking in low voices, and the intimate lighting made the whole pub feel cozy and comfortable. "Looking for Ember, Sheriff?" one of the waitresses asked, giving Cedric a too-knowing smile. "She's right behind the bar." "Oh," he said. "Right. Thank you." There probably wasn't a soul in Couchemar who didn't know that Sheriff Jameson had taken the beautiful young proprietress of the town's favorite pub out for a date. As Cedric approached the bar, he saw Ember standing over the little basin sink she kept back there, washing out a cocktail shaker. Ember did look tired, but she smiled as brightly as ever as he approached. "Hey you," she said warmly. "Got any updates?" Of course, her first question would be about the case. He filled her in on what they'd been up to on the official side of the investigation, even showing her a digital mock-up the techs had put together, depicting the ice pick that had been used as the murder weapon. At her request, he texted the picture to her. Natalie said that it probably came from her stepmother's collection, Ember said, examining the picture. "I got a look at the collection too, and I've got to say I agree. This looks like it would have fit right in." "I'm guessing I don't want to know how you got a look at this collection?" Cedric asked, arching one eyebrow. He had a distinct feeling it had to do with the reports he'd heard of a suspicious intruder who had disappeared in the middle of the night at the Bailey house. She smiled sheepishly. "I plead the fifth." Cedric sighed and shook his head. "I know what you're thinking, but I'm just really not sure I believe that John would kill his wife with a weapon stolen from his mother. This is such a careful murder in so many respects, but that little detail seems to point to him a little too tidily." "I don't know," Ember said. "I've been thinking lately about love." Cedric raised both eyebrows this time. "About love?" Ember nodded. "You know, how it makes you do stupid things. For all his faults, John clearly loved his wife. Maybe it made him stupid enough to make a glaring mistake like this one." It wasn't her most convincing line of logic, and they both knew it. But Cedric also thought he knew what she was getting at. At any rate, it was possible, and he knew better than to write off Ember's theories, even if they did sound far-fetched. That woman literally had magic intuition. So, after promising her one more time that he'd look into it, he headed back to the station, leaving Ember alone with her swirling thoughts. Ember took her break 15 minutes after Cedric left, deciding to use the picture she'd gotten from him to just ask Anna outright if she'd had an ice pick like that. She might have to drop the antiques dealer ruse, but it would be worth it to find out whether the pick had really come from Anna's collection. At the Bailey house, she rapped at the door, but there was no answer. She waited a while, then knocked again, and still no one came to find out what she wanted. So, after checking left and right over her shoulder to make sure there was no one watching, she poofed right through the door and into the living room. It still wasn't fully dark outside, so luckily there was enough light coming in through the windows to see by. Besides, Ember had now been inside this house in full daylight, so she had a better idea of what to expect. Carefully, she navigated the complex maze of furniture and made her way deeper into the house. Once she had reached the room where Anna kept the picks, Ember opened the drawer Anna had shown her before. However, the picks were no longer ranged neatly in a row, as they had been. Anna must have been suspicious enough of Ember's questioning to put them away someplace else. However, Ember did encounter a stack of photos, which seemed to be inventories for some of the antique collections she owned. There was one photo depicting a range of silver cups, and another with a picture of all of the hand mirrors. After a little flipping through the stack, Ember found a picture of Anna's entire ice pick collection. She counted them. There was one more ice pick in the photograph than there had been when Anna tallied them up. Ember was almost sure of it. She pulled up the image Cedric had sent her of the murder weapon, then carefully studied Anna's photograph, trying to see if there was a match. Her eyes nearly crossed from the effort of it. Under any other circumstances, it would have been almost possible to notice or appreciate the differences from one pic to the next. But the urgency of the situation helped Ember take note of tiny little variations. Some had slightly different lengths, thicknesses, or handle sizes, and others had little hooked endings. And finally she found one that looked just like the one from Cedric's mock-up. The pic did belong to Anna. Ember was almost certain of it. She started searching with eager energy, trying to find where Anna might have moved the collection. Eventually, in a credenza drawer in the entryway, she found a number of high-quality pouches, each of which seeming to hold something long, metal, and thin. She opened the first one and found an ice pick inside. Not the murder weapon, but one of the other ones from the collection. It was possible the murder weapon was stored inside one of these pouches. With a vengeance, Ember began to open pouch after pouch in search of the ice pick that had killed Natalie. But just as she was reaching for the last pouch, she heard the telltale scrape of someone's key in the lock. Chapter 21. Having already faced Dad and son Bailey from the business end of a firearm, Ember was in no hurry to see whether Mom Bailey was a card-carrying NRA member as well. Still, she was holding the last pouch in her hand. Her work here would be useless if she didn't at least get a peek into it, to see if it held the pick she'd been looking for. Perhaps it was her nerves, but the ties at the top of this pouch seemed more stubbornly knotted than the others had been. Ember muttered under her breath as she picked at the knot, struggling to get the pouch open. The front door opened and Anna stood there, Ember in clear view. Ember had no choice but to poof right out, and the pouch went tumbling from her hand. She hadn't been paying too much attention to where she reappeared. Luckily, she managed to rematerialize in the office at the Broken Broom. Mere seconds after she showed up, the office door opened, and one of her waitresses popped her head in. "Oh," she said with a smile. "You're here. I wasn't sure where you were taking your break." "Yeah," Ember said. "Just back here." She was a little short of breath, but she hoped it wasn't too obvious. "Great," said the waitress. "Well, we just got a huge table, so whenever you want to come back." "I'll be right out." Ember paused a moment to catch her breath, then went out to assist her employees in serving the large group that had just come in for dinner. As Ember shook up their drinks, she tried to talk herself through what had just happened. Generally speaking, it was relatively safe to do magic, even around mundanes. You just had to be sure that you didn't do it baldly and openly, and more often than not, they chalked anything strange they happened to glimpse up to their overactive imaginations, or the cheese they'd just eaten, or, in some colorful cases, chemicals in the water that the government had put there for mind control purposes. There was every chance that Anna hadn't even seen Ember. The room had been getting dark when she walked in. It was possible Ember had appeared only as a shadow, or not at all. Even if she had seen Ember, it was only for a fraction of a second. Anna would almost certainly think the sighting was a strange figment of her imagination. A stress manifestation, maybe. After all, no one really believed in that kind of magic, the kind of magic Ember could do. To people like Anna Bailey, witches only existed in the Wizard of Oz. Ember felt reasonably secure that she hadn't just outed the entire magical world to one uniquely trigger-happy local family. Trying her hardest to lose herself in the work she had to do, Ember decided it was best just to put the entire thing from her mind. Except it was difficult to put it from her mind entirely when it came swooping back in the form of John Bailey storming into the Broken Broom in a well-dressed huff, scanning the bar and zeroing in on Ember like the Terminator and stomping up to her. "Miss McNair," he said imperiously, "would you mind?" "Keep your voice down," she interrupted, looking around them. John's dramatic entrance had drawn a few lingering glances. John looked left and right, saw the people watching them, and then took a deep breath, straightening his shirt sleeves and cufflinks. When he spoke again, his volume was much lower, though his tone was certainly no less furious. Would you mind kindly telling me why my mother called and said she swore she saw you in her house tonight? Ember blinked, trying to look innocent. I don't know, John, she answered. I thought we'd talked about the fact that I don't know your mother. Oh, don't you play cute with me, John hissed. That innocent act may work on local law enforcement, but I know you know how to break into houses. Consider the fact that you know that because you were also breaking into a house, Ember suggested. With a gun, I might add. John waved a hand. That doesn't make a difference here. My mother says she saw you and then you vanished out the back door. I'm guessing you were snooping around into something about Natalie's death. Something you think you'll find in my mother's house? Ember didn't answer. Instead, she started to clean a glass pointedly, letting her eyes fall away from John's in a way that made him positively growl in frustration. I won't stand for it, he said, his voice becoming even lower and more dangerous. I feel I've been very patient with your insinuations and you poking your nose in where it doesn't have any reason to be. But this is truly the last straw. If you don't leave my mother alone, I'm going to take care of you myself. With that, he turned on his heel and left the pub, exactly as stormily as he came in. What was that about? One of the waitresses asked, hustling up toward the bar wearing a concerned expression. Nothing, Ember said as breezily as she could manage. Just an unhappy customer. It happens. The waitress tried to stay and help Ember, but Ember insisted she go and check on the tables. The truth was that John's behavior and his unmistakable threat had made her nervous. She wasn't in any doubt at all about what he meant. Ember had made enemies before in her life. She'd never intended to, but it did happen now and then. But John was quite possibly a cold-blooded murderer, one who was capable of using an ice pick to murder one innocent woman. Ember knew, if she didn't want to be next on his list, she needed to solve this case, and fast. Chapter 22. Ember wasn't only worried about herself. As a primary investigator on Natalie's case, Cedric was just as likely in John's line of sight as she was. To clear her mind, or maybe even just to hear his voice, Ember called up Cedric to voice her concerns. The phone was one ring away from redirecting to voicemail before Cedric finally picked up. Hey, Ember, he said. Cedric's tone was often dry and, to most people, emotionless. Ember wasn't just most people, though, and she could sense he was happy she called. Hi, Cedric, she said. She wasn't sure exactly what she was going to say to Cedric, but she didn't want to sound paranoid. As Ember was thinking over exactly what it was she planned to tell him, Cedric spoke up. What's up? He asked. I'd love to sit in silence with you as much as the next guy, but I've kind of got work to do. Oh, Ember exclaimed, realizing just how long she'd left him hanging. Sorry, I wanted to talk to you about something. Well, I guess that much, Cedric responded jokingly. That's kind of what phones are for. No, well, yes, said Ember. She was surprised at how flustered she was getting, but she eventually soldiered through. Being blunt would be the easiest way to get through to Cedric. Listen, Ember continued, I think you could be in danger. I'm always in danger, said Cedric. It's part of my job description. Not like that, Ember retorted. If John or Frank really is the murderer, you're a pretty likely target, especially if we start getting too close to finding out the truth. There was silence on the other end of the line as Cedric contemplated what Ember had said. Look, Ember, Cedric finally replied. I appreciate your concern, but I think you're being a bit... Ember listened with bated breath as she waited for Cedric to call her crazy. Overdramatic, Cedric finished. Ember breathed a sigh of relief. Even if Cedric didn't believe her, overdramatic was easier to cope with than crazy. I probably am, Ember responded, but I'd rather be overdramatic than underprepared. That's fair, said Cedric, but I'm always prepared. As the sheriff, it's my job to be prepared for anything that comes my way. If anyone is in danger here, I think it'd be you. Ember smiled to herself. Even though this was a serious discussion, She couldn't help but blush like a schoolgirl when Cedric expressed concern for her well-being. "Thanks, Cedric," replied Ember, "but don't you forget that I'm also very capable of taking care of myself. Even so, we all have our weaknesses." "Sure we do," Cedric replied, "and I'll be sure anyone whose weakness is John Bailey or Frank Bryant stays far, far away." Any warm fuzzies Ember had been feeling at Cedric's concern completely dissipated. He wasn't taking this seriously enough. Angrily, Ember said, "You're not invincible. You're not paying attention. It would be the perfect time to strike." Cedric chuckled. "I get what you're saying, but I can handle myself. I've got to get back to work, but don't worry, I'll be fine." Before Ember could say another word to him, Cedric hung up the phone. Hours later, Cedric decided it was finally time to call it quits for the day. Not that he wouldn't continue working once he got home, but at least there he could wear comfier pants. On the road from the sheriff's department to Cedric's house, there was a long stretch of road that gradually sloped toward the horizon. Just as Cedric got to the hill's crest and started the subtle descent, he let his foot off the pedal and cruised for a while. Gravity started giving Cedric a bit more speed than he wanted, though, so he gently pressed his foot to the brake pedal. Cedric's car continued to pick up speed. Something was wrong with the brakes. He knew he'd have to do something drastic to stop the car and avoid hurting anyone. Quickly, Cedric surveyed his surroundings and caught a tree fast approaching on his left. Thankful that no one else was on the road with him, Cedric cut across the lane going opposite his and rammed the car headfirst into the tree. The number that appeared on Ember's screen wasn't one she recognized, but she sensed something might be wrong and picked it up anyway. "Hello?" she answered curiously. "Hello, is this, Ember heard the other woman shuffling some papers before she returned. "Is this Ember McNair?" "Yes, that's me," Ember responded. "Who is this?" "Oh, yes, sorry. My name is Rebecca. I'm Sheriff Jameson's assistant." The woman sounded nervous, but whatever she was feeling, Ember felt 10 times worse. "What happened?" Ember asked. "I didn't know Cedric had an assistant." "Well, yeah, I just started," said Rebecca. "But that's not why I'm calling. Sheriff Jameson wanted me to call you and keep you up to date. I said I didn't think it was very professional to be telling this to people outside the department." Ember cut her off. "What is it, Rebecca? What are you keeping me up to date about?" Of course," Rebecca replied, flustered. "Sheriff Jameson was in an accident. He's in the hospital now." "What?" Ember shouted into the phone. "What happened? Where is he? Is he okay?" "Yes, he's fine," Rebecca said, obviously stunned by Ember's reaction. "He's the one that told me to call. Something was wrong with his car, and he crashed." "What was wrong with his car?" Ember asked as she hurriedly began gathering her things to go see Cedric. "Well, I don't know," Rebecca started. "Rebecca, it's fine. Cedric told you to call me, so tell me what happened to his car." Someone, More papers shuffled in the background as Rebecca searched through her notes. "Here it is. I guess someone cut the brake lines, the fluid leaked out, and when Sheriff Jameson needed to brake, well, he had to crash to stop the car." Ember didn't respond this time. "But," Rebecca said, trying to ease Ember, "he's totally okay. He just needed a couple of stitches in the forehead. He's a hardy guy." "Yeah," Ember sighed. "That he is." "Did he tell you if he wanted any visitors?" Rebecca giggled a little. "He said you'd ask something like that, and he also said not to worry about him, that he'll call you later." Ember smiled and set her keys and purse back down. "Okay, thanks, Rebecca." Ember hung up the phone and collapsed in a nearby chair. She was happy Cedric was okay, but that much worry was enough to exhaust even the strongest witch. Chapter 23. Not even continuing with her project of deep cleaning the kitchen managed to take Ember's mind off of this most recent, distressing news. Cedric could have been much more seriously injured. Cutting someone's brake lines was no joke, and if Cedric hadn't been a shifter, or if his reflexes had been any slower, the conversation with Rebecca might have gone very differently. Scrubbing the floors helped her burn off some of her anxious energy, and it also curbed the pressing need she was starting to feel to find Cedric, wherever he was, and watch over him to make sure something like that didn't happen again. Just then, something clattered past Ember, so close she felt the gust of it against her earlobe. Whatever it was slammed into the kitchen floor with a sharp thwack. Ember dropped her scrubbing brush and sat forward, trying to take in what she was seeing. It was a familiar-looking knife. Ember's first thought was that it must have been somewhere up on the counter, and then fallen off. But she could have sworn she felt it come past her from behind. And besides, if this knife was hers, she kept these ones in the block across the kitchen, near the back door that opened out into the alley behind the pub. Before Ember could quite make the connection, however, she felt rather than heard another knife coming her way, flung hard and fast in her direction. It might have hit her, but at the last second she whirled around and it zipped right past her shoulder, dangerously near her neck. The third she was ready for. It came careening right toward her chest, but she managed to nudge it downward with her magic, and then jump out of its way so it didn't hit her in the foot. All three knives had all come from roughly the direction of the door, but when Ember glanced up she didn't see anyone there. The door was, however, partway open, still flapping slightly. Whoever it was must have thrown the third knife and then run before waiting to see if it landed. Ember ran to the door and looked out into the alley, but as far as she could make out it was empty. Her heart was threatening to pound out of her chest. Ember slammed the door and locked it. She leaned against it a moment, breathing heavily. Why hadn't the door been locked before? Had one of the waitresses or kitchen staff from earlier in the day stepped out for a smoke and left it unlocked? Or had someone else managed to slip in during the day and unlock it, leaving it open for a planned attack later? Ember knew that this was where her investigation strengths ended, and Cedric's began. She fumbled her phone out of her pocket and gave him a call. Ember sat with Talako and Callie in the dining area, while Cedric and the crime scene techs trawled the kitchen. Talako and Callie had both shown up spontaneously, drawn from wherever their nighttime ramblings had taken them by some signal they had received communicating Ember's intense fear. It was a useful trick, Ember thought. She didn't particularly want to be alone just now. "There are no fingerprints on the knives," Cedric said, walking out from the now bustling kitchen. "And they're a match for the ones that were missing from your block. Looks like it was a crime of opportunity." "But the door was unlocked," Ember objected. "They could have come earlier, whoever it was." "It's possible," Cedric said. "We're looking into it. We've taken prints off the kitchen doorknob and lock, too. But it'll be a while before we finish eliminating your prints and your workers." And if he was smart enough to wear gloves with the knives, he probably knew to wear them on the door, too. Ember couldn't help but notice how exhausted Cedric looked. His forehead was still dark and bruised from the car accident, the stitches all too visible, reminding Ember of what danger they were both in. As if she needed to be reminded right now. Cedric looked at Callie and Talako, then leaned in closer to Ember and said in an undertone, "You must know something, or else they wouldn't be after you. What is it, Ember? You can trust me." Ember blinked, feeling tears gathering and desperate not to let them fall. "I don't think I know anything," she said. "Why, what about you?" "They're after you, too. What do you know?" He didn't answer, which meant Ember was right. If they were both onto something, enough to make the killer nervous, they still didn't have all the information they needed to understand what they were onto. "The text will be done in a few minutes," he said. "I can stay if you'd like. All night, if you feel like you're in danger. We'd be safer together than separate, after all." Over Cedric's shoulder, Talako gave Ember a thumbs up and a subtle wink. Ember flushed faintly and shook her head. "Oh no, I couldn't do that to you. My couch is all lumpy and short. You wouldn't be able to stretch out your legs." "I'm sure I could manage," he said. No. Remember all those childhood sleepovers? Hard floors and scratchy blankets? It would be like that, except I don't even have any good snacks. You don't want that. You're exhausted and you need real rest." Cedric shrugged and held up both hands in surrender. "All right, I won't push you on it. But keep me on speed dial, would you? If what you said is right, your attacker might have no idea if they succeeded in injuring you or worse. You might be in even more trouble when they find out you're alive and well. Alive? Yes. Well? Not so much. Ember thought it but didn't say it out loud. Admitting she was badly shaken up by what had just happened would probably just cause Cedric to insist on staying. I'm all right, she lied. You go get a good night's sleep, you promise? Chapter 24. First thing the next morning, Ember brewed a big cup of tea and then called Tara, the most senior waitress at the Broken Broom. Ember was more than a little nervous about going back into the pub for the day. The attack there the previous night had shaken her considerably, and even a good night's rest hadn't managed to make her any less anxious. Once the killer had been caught, Ember knew she would be all right. Until then, she asked Tara to head up the main shifts today. Everything all right, boss? Tara asked. You should be fine, Ember said, dodging the question. Just make sure that alley door stays locked all day, and don't let anyone but staff into the kitchen. Once Tara had agreed to this, and Ember had touched base with all the staff necessary to ensure that the Broken Broom could handle the day without her, Ember turned to Kaylee, who was watching curiously from her perch at the kitchen table. I'm going to bring in some backup, she told her familiar. What do you say? Talico and Sage, Kaylee offered. They've both been following the case. You know how Sage loves to gossip, and Talico might have some more insight from Natalie that we haven't heard yet. Good thinking, Ember said, and she reached out to Talico with her magic, then dialed Sage's number. Sure, Sage answered when Ember asked whether she would come over to help her puzzle out the case. I'm at breakfast with Luca, though. Mind if she comes along? We can bring food. Which was how Ember ended up in her delightfully overcrowded living room with Talico, Kaylee, Luca, and Sage ranged around her, picking through a styrofoam takeout container piled high with delicious raspberry crepes. I tell you what, I was so devastated to hear about Natalie, Luca offered. A fairy with minor telepathic powers, and the owner of Fairy Tales Inn, a sweet little hotel right in the middle of town. Luca knew anyone and everyone in Couchemar, and was often Sage's most valuable source of town gossip. What a nice girl. She's a nice ghost now, isn't she, Talico? Sage said with a sly smile. Talico did not seem to react, but Ember thought he looked pleased. She is indeed an incredibly kind person, Talico remarked. I am most invested in helping to discover who would have wanted to hurt her. It's not a question of who would have wanted to hurt her, unfortunately, Ember said. This is a case of too many suspects. People really are awful, Kaylee muttered. I'm so glad I'm not people. So let's talk it through. Sage clapped her hands and rubbed them together eagerly, leaning forward. Luca, stop messing with Ember's potted plants and focus. Luca, who had indeed been using her magical fairy powers to perk up Ember's droopy fern, pulled back her hand and shot Ember an apologetic look. Lay it on us, Luca said, smiling. So Ember walked everyone through the main evidence they had against their three primary suspects. She touched on Darren's intense, stalking behavior and the restraining order he'd violated. Then she explained about Frank and his connection with Natalie, his friendship with John, and the difficulties he'd been facing in his marriage. Finally, she gave her case for John's involvement, including how his marriage with Natalie had ended as a result of his cheating, his shifty letter-writing and house-breaking behavior following her death, and the fact that the murder weapon almost certainly came from his mother's house. So, Ember said when she'd finished, let's pool our mental resources. What does everyone here think? What does Natalie say? Sage asked Talico. Talico hesitated. She wishes she could remember more. She was afraid of Darren and John because of their recent behavior, but she also doesn't really believe either of them would have killed her. She was never scared of Deputy Bryant, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. Let's not forget that Natalie thought the killer was someone close to her own height, Kaylee interjected. Talico nodded. Just an impression she got, but worth paying attention to. That would rule out all our suspects, though, Ember objected. Maybe it was just someone crouching down low. I mean, Darren is hardly a broad oak, Luca said. Not short exactly, but much closer to Natalie's height than Frank or John. I'm inclined to believe Natalie about Darren, Sage said. I don't think he's harmless, but I don't think he's a killer either. Nothing I've heard about him around town would back that up. Then who are we thinking? Ember asked, looking around the room into each of her friends' faces. There was a prolonged silence as they all chewed it over. Then, eventually, Sage said, I think it's Frank. He sounds like he's been hiding a lot about the nature of his relationship with her in general, and that got him into trouble. He's a police officer, a man of action. He decided this was the only way he'd solve his problems. I agree, Luca piped up. Add to that, he was probably jealous about how Darren and John were always hanging around. I think it's John, Kaylee said. He's a shifty guy, and he felt both resentful of and entitled to Natalie. When he couldn't win her back, he lashed out. One of those, if I can't have you, nobody can moments. They all turned to Tlaco. John strikes me as the more violent man, he said consideringly. We know he was threatening her, trying to manipulate her. And statistically speaking, more women who are murdered are killed by their partners, or ex-partners. Now, everyone turned to Ember, eager to hear her thoughts. She thought it through, picturing both Frank and John in her head, trying to envision them with an ice pick in hand, sneaking up behind Natalie, crouched down low. Eventually, she said, John, I just think he fits better. How are you going to find out for sure? Sage asked. I think it's time to have a talk with him, Ember said. Someplace public, ideally. He usually has lunch at Kathy's Corner, Luca offered. Perfect, I'll find him there. She thanked her friends and saw them out. Only Kaylee stayed behind, but Ember told her she couldn't go along to the diner. Kathy, the diner owner, was a mundane and wouldn't like having a cat in her restaurant. Then before Ember left her place, she gave Cedric a call, but he didn't answer. Hey, it's me, she said into the voicemail recording as she walked out her door. Don't worry about me. I'm headed to Kathy's Corner to try to meet John Bailey. I'm hoping if I approach him in public, we'll be able to have an honest conversation about where he was the night Natalie was murdered. Chapter 25. Having decided she would confront John, Ember quickly made her way to Kathy's Corner. Ember entered the small diner and surveyed the area. John was sitting in one of the booths, a sandwich held up to his mouth. He hadn't noticed Ember yet. She quickly approached the booth and sat down opposite John, which finally caught his attention. What? John stammered through his lunch. He swallowed and tried again. What are you doing here? Haven't you bothered me enough? I don't think so, Ember confidently replied. You need to tell me where you were the night Natalie died. I don't need to do anything, lady, John responded. Just because you fancy yourself a detective doesn't mean I have to play along with your delusional fantasy. Ember scowled at John. Intimidation wasn't going to work. Instead, she decided to try a different route. Look, John, Ember began. She let her shoulders droop and her face relax. I know you loved Natalie, but people are talking, not just me. Don't you want to clear your name? Why should I care what everyone is saying about me? John replied. I know I didn't do it, so it shouldn't matter. But it does, said Ember. If the police are focused on you, then that means they aren't looking for the right person. By not complying, you're actively helping the murderer get away with it. John stared into Ember's cool blue eyes stoically. He didn't want to admit her logic was sound. He remained silent. Please, Ember pleaded. We need to find out who did this. Don't you want justice for Natalie? John released a heavy sigh and dropped his gaze. He stared at his half-eaten sandwich and whispered, Yeah. Ember lit up. Okay, John said, nodding his head and looking back at her. His features softened. I'll tell you where I was. Frank, too. That caught Ember off guard. She was hoping for one alibi but never expected she would get two. Ember nodded. She wanted to keep quiet and let John tell his story before he changed his mind. Frank and I were out of town that night, John admitted. Ember drooped. Out of town was a difficult alibi to corroborate, but John kept going. Sarah was gone, something about her mom being sick or something. John shook his head. I don't remember exactly what it was, but Frank and I decided we'd make a night of it. You know, for old time's sake. Where'd you go? Ember asked. We hopped over to New Orleans. A strip club, I think it was called. Velvet something, John tried to explain. Ember raised an eyebrow. Noticing her disapproval, John was quick to add, the name didn't matter once we got inside. I'm sure I could look it up, but I don't think anyone there would remember us. So no trouble there, then? Asked Ember. If this alibi is supposed to hold up, there needs to be someone who can corroborate what you're saying. I know, John replied. I'm getting to it. Next, we went to some all-night diner, then straight back to our hotel. And? Ember questioned. And, said John, my accountant has the receipts for each and every stop. All the food, the drinks, ATM withdrawals, everything. Why'd you give that to your accountant? Ember looked at him confusedly. Well, John averted his gaze, clearly hesitant to explain. I was going to have him write it off as a business expense. Ember cocked her head and made a confused face. Are you in the businesses of strip clubs and food joints? No, it's not that, John said sheepishly. Frank and I were talking about a joint venture. Cybersecurity's huge right now, and we thought we could take a crack at starting our own company. Ember wasn't there to debate the legality of John's tax write-offs, so she decided she'd let it slide. All right, Ember nodded. Now I just need you to give me this accountant's information. John was taken aback. Why? Ember smiled. Because I need to check with him that what you're saying is true. No. John shook his head. I mean, why you? Shouldn't the police handle that? This will be a lot faster. Plus, I basically work for the police anyway. Just ask Frank. Ember hoped that appealing to John's loyalty to his friend would make him give her the information she needed. The police would take an eternity to do anything with John's alibi. All right, fine, John begrudgingly agreed. He pulled his wallet from his pocket and pulled out his accountant's business card. Here you go, he said as he flicked the card across the table. Ember picked up the card and pocketed it for later use. Now, John asked, can I get back to my lunch? Ember agreed and got up to leave. As she was walking away from the table, John said, Hey, Ember? She turned back toward John. Make sure you catch this guy, okay? He said. For Natalie. Ember nodded and left Kathy's corner. That evening, Ember was waiting tables at the Broken Broom. It was a busy night and she would be glad to get off her feet when she could. Plus, she was anxious to contact John's accountant and corroborate his story. Thank you so much for coming in, Ember said to a couple after they paid their bill. Come back soon. The couple smiled and got up to leave. As they were exiting the building, Darren entered. It took Ember all of 2 seconds to recognize that he was wasted just from his stumbling walk. But he made it even more obvious when he started yelling, Listen up, all of you! Darren surveyed the pub with crisscrossed eyes. Someone took Natalie away from me, my true love. Whoever did this is going to pay. I'll kill you. Darren lazily grabbed a nearby empty chair and tossed it across the floor. Fortunately, he wasn't the type of drunk that got stronger with inebriation. Hey! Ember cautiously walked toward Darren. I know you're upset, Darren, but this is not okay. Darren wasn't listening. He grabbed for another chair and started to throw it as well, but Ember whispered a spell that knocked him out. She was close enough to catch him and gently lay him down on the floor. Sorry. She peered around the bar at all of her patrons watching the upsetting scene. It's all right, everyone. We'll take care of this. One of the waitresses walked over to Ember. Should I call the police? She asked. Yeah, I think that would be best. Ember looked down sadly at Darren. The police showed up quickly and took Darren in for public intoxication. The next morning, Darren woke up in a jail cell with a grueling headache, but he wouldn't be there long. Darren's sister, Janine, bailed him out and promised the police she would keep an eye on him while he pulled himself together. Chapter 26. John's accountant lived a few miles out of town, so Ember decided to give him a call rather than visit in person. Harris and Associates, a clipped man's voice answered. Yes, Ember said eagerly. I'm looking for Troy Harris. You've got him? Oh, good. I got your information from John Bailey. The fact is, I'm looking into the murder of John's ex-wife, Natalie. John tells me you're in possession of a few receipts that will establish his alibi for the night in question. What night is this? Troy Harris sounded significantly more interested now. Ember told him the date Natalie had died. Evidently, it's some receipts from a night out in New Orleans. Then, because she was feeling generous and grateful to John for finally cooperating, she said, some sort of new business venture idea. Right, of course, Troy said. Cybersecurity. He was telling me about it. All a little over my head, to be honest. Ember had a feeling that whatever John had told Troy about that business outing, it had been intended to go over Troy's head. Ah, yes, here they were. A handful of receipts from what looked like bars, probably, and a hotel, and what would you like me to do with them? Fax them over to the sheriff's department? Ember blushed. All right. So she'd never officially mentioned she wasn't with the sheriff's department. She had a feeling she ought to fess up now. Wasn't it very much illegal to impersonate a police officer? But she needed to see this alibi with her own two eyes if she was really going to believe that both John and Frank were off the suspect list. Fax? She laughed. No need for that. Just snap a picture with your phone and text it to this number. All right, Troy said brightly. Can do. They hung up, and less than a minute later, Ember received the pictures of the receipts, all ranged out on Troy Harris's desk. Yes, there was the alibi, plain and simple. John's signature was scrawled across most of these receipts. However, it occurred to Ember that the receipts alone didn't establish that Frank had been out of town. John's eyewitness account did, but the two were close friends who went way back. It was still possible that John was lying to protect his friend. If Frank could corroborate some of the same details John had shared, unprompted, then she'd have no choice but to accept that John had been telling the truth. But she needed to find and talk to Frank fast, before he and John had the opportunity to compare stories. Ember checked her watch. It was just after lunchtime. Frank was almost always on shift at this time of day, so she gave a call over to the station. Hello, Sheriff's Department. How may I direct your call? Ember recognized Rebecca's voice. Hey, Rebecca, it's me, Ember McNair. You remember? Oh, yes, of course. Hello, Ember, Rebecca said brightly. You want me to patch you through to Cedric? No. She didn't explain to Rebecca that she had Cedric's cell number and easily could have called him directly if that's what she'd wanted to do. I was wondering if Frank Bryant was around. I'm hoping to have a quick conversation with him. Let me check. Sorry, I'm still getting used to all this, Rebecca said. Ember was about to reassure her that she was doing just fine, when suddenly the line went dead. Blinking, Ember pulled her phone and looked at the screen. Yes, Rebecca had apparently hung up the phone while intending to put Ember on hold. Ember was just about to dial the number again when her screen lit up with a call from the sheriff's department. Oops, sorry about that. I guess you must have hung up, Rebecca said when Ember answered her phone. I didn't hang up, you hung up. Ember began to object, but Rebecca talked right over her. I'm sorry, but Deputy Bryant isn't around. Oh, okay. Is he out on a call or something? No, I'm afraid to say he never showed up for his shift today. Very curious. We managed to get another one of the deputies to come in and cover it, but really it is quite difficult. The scheduling is also complex and... Thanks, Rebecca, Ember said, then hung up. She felt a little rude for doing so, but her mind was racing. Where could Frank be? Well, he was a frequent enough customer at the bar. She called there, and Tara answered. "Frank? That deputy with the chicken?" Tara asked, once Ember explained who she was looking for. "That's the one," Ember said. No, he's not here. Haven't seen him today." "Okay, thanks." Ember killed the line, then paced up and down the sidewalk a few steps, doubling back again and again. It seemed likely to Ember that Frank had run off, skipped town entirely. She already suspected that he was involved somehow in Natalie's murder, and now his behavior only made her all the more suspicious. Of course, there could be other reasons behind his disappearance besides fleeing justice. After all, if Ember thought he might be guilty of Natalie's murder, then there was a possibility others felt the same. Specifically, one other person. Someone who would be very displeased with anyone who might have caused Natalie harm. Maybe someone who already had reason to dislike Frank Bryant. This time, Ember dialed Cedric directly. "What's up?" he answered, sounding a little harried. No doubt he was stressed at the disappearance of his deputy. Cedric probably thought it was only Frank's recent spate of despondency over Natalie's death that had stopped him coming in for his shift this morning. "Where are you right now?" Ember asked him. "The station," Cedric said, annoyed tone seeping away in response to the urgency in Ember's voice. "My office. Why?" "Darren's place," Ember said, already a little breathless with excitement. "How soon could you meet me there?" He didn't ask any questions. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." Chapter 27. Darren's house was only a few minutes' walk from where Ember had been lingering on the sidewalk downtown. The day was bright and hot, and Ember was sweating unpleasantly as she picked up the pace, but she barely even noticed she was so focused on the case. Neither did she notice the people downtown, eating outside of restaurants and cafes clustered around little bistro tables, turning their heads to watch her half walk, half run, clearly lost in urgent thought. All along the walk to Darren's, Ember traced back through all the clues she had, everything she knew about each of the suspects. John was out of the running to be the killer himself. That had very clearly been his signature on those receipts, placing him firmly in New Orleans on the night of the murder. But that didn't mean he was entirely innocent in this. Ember couldn't ignore the fact that he and Frank had been such close friends for such a long time, and not exactly forthright with Ember about that connection either, which meant that he and Frank still could have been working together to kill Natalie. John was the alibi, living it up in New Orleans, while Frank was left behind to do the dirty work. John just had to insist Frank was with him and they'd both be covered by his story. And Frank's motive for killing Natalie was also important to consider. His attachment to her was clearly undermining his marriage. Insecure and jealous as Sarah clearly was, Ember didn't think Frank wanted to lose his wife over a friendship, no matter how close of one. However, was that really enough to justify murder? Frank seemed down lately, but he was usually a charming, happy guy. And he'd seemed genuinely upset by Natalie's death. Besides, if he and John had arranged the New Orleans alibi together, then Ember couldn't account for John's eager conviction when he'd asked her to find Natalie's murderer. So maybe that theory didn't hold as much water as she'd thought. Which brought her to the third and final suspect. Try as she might, Ember didn't really believe Darren had done it. He'd fallen to the bottom of her suspects list early on. This crime had taken not only an acute degree of brutality, but also an awful lot of organization. And she just didn't see Darren managing it on his own. The man was clearly falling apart. He'd always been unstable, but his instability had gotten severe in the wake of Natalie's death. Maybe if he'd killed her in some sudden, violent way, he might have been losing it like this after, out of a sense of guilt and regret. But the murder had been so utterly cold-blooded. She couldn't see Darren executing it and then losing his grip on reality the way he was doing. However, for all that she didn't think he'd killed Natalie, she definitely didn't think Darren was harmless. If he thought he had figured out who Natalie's killer was, then that person would be in serious danger. With Frank's sudden unexplained disappearance, Ember thought there was a major chance Darren had been the one to stop Frank from showing up for his shift that morning. Who else had any reason to cause Frank harm? Her brain snagged on the question. She had just rounded the corner, and Darren's house was already in sight. Cedric was probably more than halfway there. But now, with a sudden flash of conviction, Ember knew they were headed to the wrong place. She called Cedric. He picked up before the first ring was over. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "I can't explain it, not exactly, but you've got to meet me someplace else." "Where?" he asked. "Where are you?" She told him where to meet her. Before he could object or ask what she was thinking, she said, "I'll explain it all when there's time, but I think Frank is in serious danger. I'm at Darren's now, but I'll magic my way over there." "If it's dangerous, don't go in without me," he warned her. "Wait outside. I'll be there in 2. "All right," she said. Normally, she might have fought, but something in the intensity of his voice compelled her to agree. When they hung up, Ember ducked around the side of the house, made sure no one was looking, and then disappeared. She reappeared behind a tree in a sleepy residential neighborhood near the sheriff's department offices. She'd been here once before, for a department cookout Frank had hosted. She'd never set foot in the house, but had walked around carrying a tray of beignets into the backyard, which had been full of summer smells and friendly voices. The scene was very different today. The street was eerily quiet, the Bryant house still and serene. Ember paced restlessly in front of it. If only she hadn't promised Cedric she wouldn't rush in ahead. Anything at all might be happening in there, right at this moment, while Ember stood uselessly outside. Cedric pulled up quickly, the tires of his cruiser screeching to a stop. "All right," he said as he hastily climbed out of the car. "What's going on?" As rapidly as she could, she explained to him what her theory was. Not only who she thought had killed Natalie, but who she suspected Frank was in danger from right at this moment. "It makes sense," Cedric agreed. He didn't unholster his gun, but he did pat it, as if to assure himself it was there. "I'm just going to go in and see if Frank is home. If he's all right. I'll keep my wits about me, don't you worry." "The killer could be in there," Ember pleaded. "I know, I'll be on guard, but you have to promise to wait out here, all right?" "Wait," Ember objected. "I'm going in there with you." Cedric gripped both her shoulders. "We don't have time to argue. I'm not letting you get hurt, so you just stay right out here. I've already radioed in for backup. They should be here before too long." He didn't pause for her to agree, but raced in the door. Ember waited as long as she could, she really did. But after a minute had passed of her watching the silent house, worrying about what was going on inside, she reasoned with herself that it was better to ask for forgiveness than to let horrible harm befall someone who meant so much to her, under her watch. So she snuck up to the door and let herself in after him. Chapter 28. Inside the Bryant house, Ember paused, listening, trying to tell where Cedric might have gone. She wasn't sure if the fact that she couldn't hear anything was a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe the killer wasn't here after all. Except that right as the thought entered her mind, she heard the sound of a small scuffle coming from some other room, further in the house. She didn't hesitate, but took off running after it. She passed a series of rooms and a staircase leading up to the upper floor, then found herself entering a sunken-in den, a kind of man cave room that Ember assumed was primarily Frank's domain. Unlike the other rooms in the house, which were all done up in kitschy candle holders and plug-in oil diffusers, this space was lined with TV and movie posters. Every wall boasted shelves that were lined with miniature figurines, and there was a large gaming table near the back. It was the perfect visual metaphor for the Bryants' marriage. Ember couldn't help thinking how ill-suited the two were for each other. It was also, at the moment, the scene of a pretty alarming confrontation. Sarah Bryant stood, fully dressed in a floral blouse and khaki capris, hair done up like she was just about to step out for the day. She looked just like she had every other time Ember had met her, except this time she was holding a gun, pressing the muzzle of it against Cedric's head. "That's right," Ember heard Sarah say when she drew close enough to the doorway. "Just take a seat right there." They were both faced away from Ember, so she withdrew behind the doorway enough that she wouldn't be immediately visible, too shocked for the moment to intervene. Cedric had his hands in the air. He hadn't come in with his gun drawn, that much was evident. It was still clipped securely in its holster. Despite Ember's warnings about Sarah, and her theory about the way in which Sarah had committed cold-blooded murder, Cedric had still clearly thought this situation could be handled peaceably. Now he was being forced at gunpoint into what looked like a lazy-boy. As Cedric lowered himself into the chair, Ember peered further into the room and had to suppress a gasp. In another plush recliner, hands and legs tied with thick rope and quite clearly unconscious, sat Frank Bryant, head lolling to the side at a painful angle. "That's right," Sarah said as Cedric sat down. "Now hold out your hands in front of you and I'll get you tied up just right." Cedric complied, and Sarah turned to reach for a length of rope laid out across the nearby table. The second the gunpoint was aimed away from Cedric, however, Ember reacted, reaching out a tendril of magical will and flicking the gun out of Sarah's grip. She might have been able to fight it, but she wasn't expecting it. The gun went flying, crashed against the nearby wall, and slid down to the floor behind a bookcase teeming with board game boxes. "No!" Sarah cried, diving after the gun, but Cedric was on her, springing from the chair and leaping after her. The two went down in a mighty crash of bodies. Cedric, nervous about crushing Sarah, he was nearly twice her size, rolled slightly to the side as he fell, which was a mistake. It gave Sarah the opportunity to go scuttling out from underneath him, and when he tried to grip her blouse to stop her, she only surged forward, utterly unconcerned when the fabric of the hem ripped off in Cedric's hand. Gone was the fashionable suburban woman. She had turned half-animal in her desperation to get back to her gun. Cedric had to stop treating her gingerly. After all, mere seconds ago she'd had a gun to his head. He gripped both her legs at the ankles and pulled her roughly back across the carpet, drawing her grasping hands out of reach of the bookshelf behind which her gun had fallen. Now she caught sight of Cedric's own service weapon, and her eyes grew wide and wild. She reached out toward him as if she could reach his gun before he did. He didn't want to shoot her, so instead of drawing his weapon, he intercepted her hands, gripping both her wrists hard and then flipping her against the floor. Meanwhile, reasoning that Cedric could handle Sarah by himself, Ember rushed to Frank's side. First, she tried to rouse him by slapping his cheeks lightly, but he was out cold. She checked that he was breathing and was relieved to feel the little gust of air against the back of her hand. "You are under arrest for the murder of Natalie Gordon and the attempted murders of Frank Bryant and Ember McNair," Cedric was saying. He had managed to get the upper hand, and was now pinning Sarah to the ground in what appeared to be a very uncomfortable position. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say." Sarah was crying loudly, not listening, shouting obscenities and fruitlessly trying to buck Cedric off of her. Ember stopped paying attention to the two of them. Cedric had mentioned there was police backup on its way, but Frank would need an ambulance, and fast. It looked to her like Sarah must have hit him hard in the back of his head, possibly with the butt of the pistol. "He's hurt pretty badly," Ember said, breathless, when Cedric had finished listing Sarah's rights. "Call it in," Cedric told her, nodding to her phone. She grappled it out of her pocket and with shaking hands dialed emergency services. She did her best to explain the urgency of the situation to the operator, but as soon as they heard that Cedric was there, they assured Ember that there would be an ambulance on the way immediately. Ember stayed on the line, keeping her fingers on Frank's pulse until they could hear the sirens. Chapter 29. The ambulance and the backup Cedric had phoned in arrived at roughly the same time. Suddenly, a whole host of heavy footsteps were bursting in the front door of the Bryants' tidy, respectable house. "Back here," Cedric called, and after a couple seconds they were all pouring into Frank's den. "Hurry," Ember urged, waving the paramedics over to Frank. She had managed to get the ropes around him untied, but the knots had been tight, and she worried about the circulation in his hands and feet. "We've got it from here." One paramedic paused long enough to reassure Ember, then dived back into the job of getting Frank on a gurney and safely into the ambulance that was waiting outside. As Ember looked on fretfully, Cedric oversaw Sarah Bryant's official arrest. After all the trouble she had caused to Ember, Cedric, and Couchemar in general, Ember felt perversely gratified to see her led off in handcuffs. No sooner had Sarah been tucked into the back of the deputy's police cruiser The door shut firmly on her scowling, tear-streaked face. Then Cedric turned to Ember. They were standing in the front lawn, out in front of the house, and all the other emergency responders were milling about the yard, politely pretending not to see as Cedric crossed to Ember in a handful of large strides. "Are you all right?" she asked, or tried to ask, but was cut off halfway through when Cedric swept Ember up into a tight hug, muffling her words against his large, firm shoulder. "Thank you," he said, not letting her go, even after the socially acceptable time for ending hugs had certainly passed. "You really saved me in there. Thank you, Ember." "Oh," she said, turning her face to the side so she wasn't speaking directly into his shirt anymore. "It's nothing." "It's really not," he said. "You came in to help me even when I told you not to." "And you're not annoyed by that?" He huffed out a laugh. It was curiously exciting, feeling the laugh move through his chest, pressed up close against him as she was. He pulled back enough to look down into her eyes, arms still encircling her. "No," he said. "I'm not annoyed by it." "Well, good," she said, going for a light tone and missing by a mile. "Because I'm tired of seeing you in the hospital all the time, you know. You think it's all right to just go around getting injured all the time? Not acceptable, Sheriff." He laughed again, then vaulted her up into the air like she was made of nothing and spun her around. For a second, she felt utterly weightless, and she let out a startled little whoop of excitement. She trusted her weight fully in his strong, capable arms, and when he set her down again, her heart was fluttering somewhere in her throat, her mouth stretched into a broad smile. "I'm going to go to the hospital," he explained. "Check on Frank. I can give you a call when I find out how he's doing?" She nodded. "I'd like that." "Good," he said. Then, to her surprise, before she could process what was happening, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle but not tentative. He had shockingly soft, lovely lips, and Ember didn't think for a second of pulling away, just leaned more closely into it, craning her neck until she found that he was somehow closer. She didn't question it, just enjoyed the feeling. Luckily, the paramedics had gone, and all of the deputies had turned their backs on the scene minutes before, in an attempt to give their sheriff some much-deserved privacy. So no one, not even Ember or Cedric, noticed that Ember had begun to float several inches off the ground, closing the distance between them, pressing upward into the kiss. Later, as she was closing up the broken broom, Ember still felt as if she was walking on air, particularly after receiving a quick phone call from Cedric, letting her know that Frank was going to be all right. This news she reported to Sage and Kaylee, who had also been eagerly awaiting it. "That's wonderful to hear," Sage cried, raising her glass as if in a toast, although she was only drinking an Italian soda. "Now I suppose the question is, what's he going to do with himself?" Kaylee mused. "His wife is a murderer, after all." "All because she was jealous of Natalie," Sage said sadly. "There wasn't even really anything going on between them, was there?" "Yes," Kaylee interjected. "You didn't quite explain how you figured it out." "There wasn't ever really anything between them," Ember said. "They really were just friends, like Frank had always said. He'd known her better than he claimed to me initially, since she was married to his buddy John, but he never had any romantic interest in her. I think it was just the case that he wasn't being validated in his interests or personality at home, and Natalie was friendly and non-judgmental." "But Sarah couldn't see it that way," Sage said. "Yeah," Ember agreed. "She's one of those men and women can't be friends types. Once I figured out that Frank had been taken by someone, and my gut was telling me it wasn't Darren, I realized that Sarah was the only person who made sense." "Sarah." The word seemed to come out of thin air, but it was followed seconds later by the apparition of Natalie Gordon, slowly phasing into view like a lamp gradually brightening. Talako appeared next to her. Natalie looked at Ember with a hazy expression on her face. "Sarah Bryant? Is it true?" Somberly, Ember nodded. "I'm so sorry," she said. But Natalie didn't look sorry at all. She looked as if a great peace had descended on her. Her eyes lost focus, and suddenly she was looking somewhere over Ember's shoulder. But when Ember turned to follow her gaze, there was nothing there but a row of bottles. "I see it," Natalie said. "The light." She turned and took Talico's face in her ghostly hands, then angled him so that she could press a quick, soft kiss to his lips. The kiss lasted a second only, and then the particles of light that made up Natalie's form burst, dissipated like a cloud of fireflies, and she was gone. Chapter 30. "So, do you want to hear the hot gossip or not?" Sage asked, plopping down excitedly at the bar. "Please," Ember said, rubbing her temples. "I am so tired of gossip. Besides, I've heard it all." It was over a week after the showdown at the Bryant's house, and Couchemar was slowly managing to return to normal, the townspeople moving on from all their tongue-wagging about what Sarah Bryant had done. Ember had been forced to correct a number of misapprehensions and outright lies about the nature of Frank Bryant and Natalie Gordon's relationship. Luckily, at least Natalie's ghost wasn't around any longer to be plagued by that kind of salacious news. "Not this stuff," Sage said. "I promise this will be new to you. And it'll make you feel better." She waggled her fingers in elaborate jazz hands. "It's all that gooey, happy-ending stuff you love." "I could go for some gooey, happy-ending news," Kaylee interjected, popping her head up from behind the bar. Ember pushed her head below the bar top level before any customers could see her. Kaylee stuck out her little pink tongue at Ember in protest. "Great. Then you'll love to hear that Deputy Frank has been given a job up in Baton Rouge." Ember was heartened to hear this, as a matter of fact. She'd been distressed when he left the hospital just to resign his position at the sheriff's department. She'd even urged Cedric not to accept the resignation, to request that Frank take some time off first and think it over. But Frank had been adamant. Evidently, he couldn't stand the idea of continuing to live in the town where his wife had murdered someone, and attempted to murder several others, of course. Ember had still resisted the idea, but Cedric reminded her that it was Frank's choice. So he had been granted his resignation, without even the requirement for 2 weeks' final work. The department had taken up a collection to help fund his relocation. And according to Sage's news, he would be set up in Baton Rouge with a new job and a new life in no time. "That's amazing news," Ember said sincerely. "Thanks for bringing that in, Sage." "I'm not done," Sage cried. She held up 2 fingers. "News item numero 2. John has been forced to put the house on the market." "The one he loved so much?" Kaylee asked. Sage nodded. "Maybe not quite good news. More like neutral news. But I like to think Natalie's ghost would be pettily gratified to know that her cheating ex didn't get the house back." Ember smiled and bobbed her head. "Good to know. If I ever see her again, I'll tell her." Though they all knew they wouldn't be seeing Natalie's ghost again. And number 3. Sage held up a 3rd finger. Possibly the best news of all. Darren has enrolled in AA. Ember was delighted to hear this, though she tried not to look too excited. She shot Sage a disapproving frown. "Isn't the second A supposed to mean anonymous?" "It's not like I'm going to go blabbing it around town," Sage objected. "But nothing's anonymous long from these ears." "Have you heard the news about Ember and the sheriff?" Kaylee said, grinning when Ember shot her a warning look. Sage beamed. "Oh, you mean that they're having a cozy little movie night date up at Ember's tonight to celebrate solving the mystery together?" "That's the one," Kaylee said. "Shh," Ember urged, blushing fiercely. "How did you even hear that, Sage?" "Never mind. I don't want to know how that one got around the rumor mill." "It sounds very romantic," Sage said, beaming. "Really?" Ember asked, flicking a dry cleaning cloth across the bar in Sage's direction. "Because to me it sounds very none of your business." The movie night turned into talking over the movie night, and then into talking late into the night on Ember's sofa, putting on one movie after another as an excuse to keep chatting. The spirit of celebration and camaraderie made the evening warm and friendly. Ember felt, for the very first time since all of this had begun, like she could finally, really relax. Being around Cedric was like that. She was so comfortable, in fact, that she didn't even realize how tired she was until she found herself nodding off. The next thing she knew, she was waking up in the earliest hours of the morning, stretched out on the couch. Cedric had fallen asleep across from her, half propped up against the sofa's arm, his feet tucked underneath Ember's body in a way that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. She must have stirred, or else his wolf senses had him on alert, because no sooner had she woken than his eyes opened too. He looked discombobulated for a moment, then when he caught Ember looking at him, he smiled sleepily. "See?" he said. "It's not so bad sleeping on your couch after all." She laughed, embarrassed but pleased that he didn't seem upset at having fallen asleep at her place. "Sure. We'll see what your back is telling you later on today." He gave her a playful little nudge with his foot, one that felt intimate and sweet in a way that had her heart nearly bursting from her chest. "I seem to recall another much ruder awakening," he said. "Back in childhood. Don't you remember?" Chuckling, she said, "No. Remind me." God, I wish I could forget. All of us falling asleep after stargazing, out in the yard. We ended up out there all night. And then first thing in the morning, your older sister dumping what must have been a full bucket of ice-cold water all over me. I thought I was going to die. He was laughing, but Ember felt a strange static in her ears, and her smile and warm feeling faded to confusion. She stared at him until his laughter faded, and he gave her a questioning, uncertain look. When he'd gone quiet, Ember said, uncomprehending, "Cedric, I don't have an older sister."